Okay, well, I guess we'll begin then. I'm speaking in English because our first three papers are in English, so it makes sense. I guess my only job or main job is just to be the time police, and just doing a quick calculation. If my mathematics is correct, and Raul can correct me if it's not. I think we have 40 minutes each. Is that right, Raul? From what I can see.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
Yeah.
So, and I will keep everyone to those 40 minutes so that the people later on don't lose chunks of their time. So, and I guess that means, aim for no more than 30 minutes of reading time so there can be at least 10 minutes of discussion. So I guess with that, we'll just begin with Alan Pichanick, who's going to speak on the Koinon Agathon of Plato's Charmides.
Great, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Maybe next year we'll be in person, I hope. But it's good to see you all, and thank you all for permitting me to present this. Thank you for the organizing committee. This is sort of a part of a larger project, but I would say it's more of an offshoot. I'm working on a book on the Charmides, the Republic, and the Symposium. So this is maybe a tangential point that I make there. So given the number of references to Koinonia in Plato's dialogue, it is striking that the phrase common good, Koinon Agathon, is used only once with any specificity. It's at Charmides 166d. Socrates asks his interlocutor, Critias, a provocative question. He says, do you not think it is for the common good, almost, skedon, of all men, that how all the beings are should come to be discovered? The question emerges after Critias has claimed that sophrosune is self-knowledge, which he specifies as a knowledge of all other knowledges and of itself. Critias has grown exasperated with Socrates' questions about this notion. He claims that Socrates seeks only to refute him, and does not inquire seriously into the unique reflexivity of the virtue. So in this paper, I will show that it is no accident that Socrates mentions the common good at precisely this moment in his discussion with Critias. Socrates' questions are not unfair. Rather, they reveal what Socrates thinks to be an essential feature of self-knowledge, its orientation to the good beyond it. In contrast, the notion of sophrosune that Critias defends is incoherent, owing to what Critias claims to be its distinguishing feature, its reflexivity. Because of its total reflexivity, it points to no end beyond itself, and thereby it is neither capable of disclosing the beings, nor of being connected to any good outside of itself. As such, it becomes impossible to say how this virtue is either possible or beneficial to one who were to possess it. So at the middle of the dialogue, Critias insists that sophrosune is best understood as self-knowledge. After he presents an interpretation of the famous inscription at Delphi, Gnothi se auton, Socrates asks a simple question. If sophrosune is indeed some knowledge, an episteme, is it a knowledge of something? Socrates is asking for the object of this episteme, and Critias has a ready answer. He says, oneself. This is the first direct reference to reflexivity in the argument of the dialogue, but it remains opaque what Critias means by his claim. In order to proceed, Socrates does not investigate the faculty or activity of knowing that takes oneself as one's object, but instead asks Critias about the object of the knowing. Socrates introduces the examples of medicine, not for the first time, and house building, referring to each as an episteme, and shows that in these cases we can point to an object or a product distinct from the episteme itself. Medicine has health, for example. In what way, and obviously a house building has the house, right? So Socrates links that distinct object with its benefit. So in what way, we might ask, is this knowledge, self-knowledge, is self-knowledge oriented towards some benefit beyond it, some good beyond it? We could see how one might answer the question in the examples Socrates uses. For he goes on to say that the product, the ergon of house building, as I said, is the finished house, and one could say something similar for all other techni. Socrates encourages Critias to point to a distinct object of this episteme called sophrosune, to say what beautiful work it produces. And at this point, Critias claims that Socrates is inquiring incorrectly. But in my view, Critias does not understand the significance of Socrates' question. We should consider why Socrates is so insistent on getting at the of what, the tinos, right, regarding sophrosune. His question implies that we define knowledges, we define epistemi, not by investigating the subjective cognitive faculty we call knowing, but by considering the specific object known, which delimits the knowledge under investigation. Socrates is suggesting that knowledge is essentially intentional. It is defined by an object other than itself. Critias might be able to offer a suitable candidate in response to Socrates' question by claiming that the object of this self-knowledge, distinct from the knowing activity, is the human soul. In fact, this seems to be what he is suggesting when he first mentions oneself. If he were to say this, the conversation might then take a quite different turn from the one it takes. For Socrates and Critias could at this point begin discussing more explicitly the nature of the soul, and could end up with a conversation like the one that occurs in Alcibiades 1. But Critias chooses to respond to Socrates' request for a beautiful work by claiming that sophrosune is not like other knowledges. Sophrosune does not have a separable product like house building and medicine. He says that Socrates is wrong to compare it to them. And then he asserts that even arithmetic and geometry are unlike house building and medicine in this way. He thus challenges Socrates. He says to him, what is such a work of the art of arithmetic or of geometry in the way a house is of house building? And he says Socrates won't be able to give him an example. Now, Critias is right that while house building and weaving focus on a tangible material product, there is properly no parallel tangible material product for geometry and arithmetic. But Critias categorically rejects productive techni as appropriate models for understanding sophrosune. Socrates agrees that these knowledges do not issue an inseparable product in the same way. Arithmetic and geometry, Socrates says, do have separable products, even though they're not tangible material products. And in this sense, they are still intentional. They are still of something, right? So arithmetic is of the even and the odd, right? For example, even though that's not a thing like a house, right? So Critias claims in response to that, that Socrates is still attempting to seek sameness where there is only heterogeneity. He wants sophrosune to be unlike the other epistemi in just this way. Quote, he says, while all other epistemi are of something else, but not of themselves, this one alone is an episteme of all the others and of itself. Yeah, that's 166c. So we should note that it is Critias, by the way, not Socrates, who moves from his earlier claim about knowledge of oneself to the present formulation, knowledge of itself. That's a Critian move, not a Socratic one. A lot of ink has been spilled about that transition. I don't think we need to concern ourselves with it today, but if you have questions about it, we can talk about it afterwards. But if we consider carefully what is implied in this definition, knowledge of all other knowledges and of itself, we will see, and this is my focus today, it rests on Critias's thumotic attachment to his own things, at the expense of any good beyond this attachment. The thumos, right, of Critias is present early in the conversation with Socrates, when his ward Charmides enters the palestra. Critias's praise of his young cousin is a boast to Socrates about both his looks and his character. Critias wants Socrates to be awed by his finest prized possession. His view of his relationship towards Charmides and his thumos, which is inextricably wrapped up in it, is most visible upon Critias's own entrance to the conversation. This entrance, Critias's entrance, is provoked after Charmides asserts the definition of sophrosyne to be doing one's own things, a notion whose origin Socrates immediately and rightly suspects to be Critias himself. That's where Charmides got it. Critias is unable to hold back from entering the conversation after Charmides fails to respond to the objections that Socrates makes to the definition. And he incites Charmides to say about his elder guardian, well, he was reputed to be quite wise. When Critias bursts in to interrupt, he reprimands young Charmides for implying that his elder guardian did not know what he was talking about, an implication that further suggests that Critias himself, in praising Charmides, does not know his own things. Socrates describes Critias as angry with him, just as a poet is with an actor who recites his poems badly. It's a great metaphor. The author has been betrayed by the one whom he trusted to perform the work that is properly his. Charmides rouses Critias's anger in a moment that not only embarrasses Critias, but also threatens him. Critias's control of the youth has been weakened. So his thumos here and throughout the dialogue displays both the desire for victory and the desire for honor that define the trait in Republic 8. I believe this thumos is at the root of Critias's notion of knowledge of itself and the other knowledges. To possess a knowledge which has all others and itself as its object is to have a knowledge that is both all-inclusive and reflexive, generality and self-reference. Critias offers it in an attempt to explain how his conception of self-knowledge can indeed benefit the one who possesses it, even if it's not defined by an object distinct from it. He puts forward knowledge of the other knowledges and of itself in order to describe a knowledge that is architectonic in its subordination of the other knowledges. So, for example, this is not unique to Plato's, and this is kind of in a bunch of places in the Platonic dialogues. The knowledge of bridle making is subordinate to the knowledge of horse riding. It's the person who rides the horse who puts the bridle to test and thus supplies the standard to the bridle maker. If such a knowledge is possible, Critias seems to be claiming that the person who possessed it would seem to know the purpose of all subordinated knowledges. The one with sophrosyne would be, in his eyes, the one with the knowledge that somehow stands above all others and needs nothing beyond itself. It is the ruling science that subordinates all others to serve its proper ends. I think we should regard this notion with suspicion. And it is important that we not confuse it with a potential knowledge of the good. A knowledge of the good, if it exists, would point to an ultimate standard that transcends the activity of knowing, and that could even answer the question whether and why it might be good to have the very knowledge. The self-knowledge Critias describes yields a conception of knowing that is not oriented to any standard outside of itself. Rather than see this notion as a philosophical account of the supremacy of the good, at this point, we should be provoked to wonder if this is the very self-knowledge a tyrant would promote. Totalizing and reflexive in its purview, it seeks no object beyond itself and what it rules. On Critias's account, self-knowledge is antecedent to knowledge of the good. It is the definition of one's own things that dictates what is good and not good. The distinction between friend and enemy, between what is one's own and what is other, is primary. In this scenario, that which is threatening to my defined sense of self and other is seen to be bad. That which is strange, alien, unable to fit my conceptual framework cannot be good. Good, the word good, is reserved for that which confirms one's already established view of oneself. So that's why we should say that Critias's account of self-knowledge here is through and through thumotic, just as it fails to be properly erotic, in not being oriented to an other beyond itself, which is what Eros goes after. In refusing to admit as good or even as being anything that falls outside of its self-determined standard, it effectively aims to spread itself throughout the whole and loses sight of the individual human soul that is the proper object of the person seeking self-knowledge. Critias's account fails to adequately describe the very situation that he himself is in with Socrates, a conversation in which the participants are seeking knowledge they lack about themselves. Such a conversation must be possible, for Plato is able to dramatically depict it. But the account Critias proposes renders inexplicable the very conversation in which the notion has emerged. For Critias's account of self-knowledge, in restricting its purview to itself as knowledge and to all other objects, insofar as they too are knowledges, cannot reveal knowledge of the self as one seeking such wisdom. So in sum, Critias has a reply to Socrates' question. Remember, it was of what is sophrosune? And his reply is, it's of everything. But Socrates will show that that answer is equivalent to saying that it is actually of nothing. Even if it were possible, Socrates shows that such a knowledge would be of no benefit to the knower, for it would ultimately have no content that it knows, such as the good itself, which would be known by some other knowledges. And those two things I just said are essentially the main arguments that take up the remainder of the dialogue after this moment. I don't have time here to elaborate on those arguments in detail, but I will point out this. Let's consider Socrates' small but significant addition to the notion that Critias proposes. Critias's formulation is coupled with an attack on Socrates' method on the conversation. In addition to claiming that Socrates is not inquiring correctly, Critias asserts that Socrates knows very well the truth of the phrase he has just uttered and is just seeking to refute him. Socrates takes this opportunity to profess ignorance. But he now sees that Critias is in danger of not continuing. He is able to calm Critias down and re-engage with him by telling him not to worry whether it is Critias or Socrates who is refuted, to focus solely on the argument itself. And it's at this moment that Socrates makes a small comment to Critias in which his own, what we can call Socratic sophrosune, comes to light. I'll read this whole quote. He says, "Critias, you come at me as though I claim to know what I am asking about and would agree with you if only I were willing. But that's not how it is. For I am inquiring along with you about whatever is proposed because I don't know. Therefore, after I investigate, I am willing to say whether I agree or not. But wait until I investigate." So Critias claims Socrates already agrees with his claim that sophrosune is self-knowledge. And thus he implies that from where he sits, Socrates already knows what sophrosune is. But Socrates claims that he does not know and cannot yet say whether he agrees or disagrees with Critias. The response reveals that Critias does not grasp Socrates' own view at all. Socrates is claiming that he must investigate what Critias means by these words in order to discover whether they are true. While Critias supposes he has the answers and is ready to argue for them, Socrates claims he does not know and is ready to inquire. His ignorance motivates his search for knowledge, while Critias's claim to know conceals his own ignorance. So Socrates has an outlook and character that I would call genuinely philosophical. I think we would all call it genuinely philosophical. He's aware that he's lacking wisdom and he has a real desire for it. He's erotic, right? But for Critias, any such desire for wisdom is outweighed by his concern for his reputation. His desire for victory, his desire to be seen as wise, get in the way of his ability to admit ignorance and seek. To put it briefly, the thumos of Critias trumps his eros. Whereas Socrates sees the need for investigation and thus recognizes the limits of Critias's definition of sophrosune, Critias in no way seeks to investigate. After Socrates claims it is necessary to do so, to investigate, Critias responds, investigate then, right? It's a second person imperative. It is not a hortatory, let us do this together, that would be heard from one who actually wished to discover the truth with Socrates. Critias cannot do what Socrates himself shows, namely that an inquiry, any inquiry deserving of the name, is an act of a philosophical soul motivated by recognition of ignorance and the genuine eros to transcend it. So Socrates is aware, Critias' thumos is running the show, and so he even tells Critias to be courageous, and to put aside whether it is Critias or Socrates being refuted. If Critias abandons the inquiry at this point, he would be seen as a coward, and he knows it. What Critias does not see is that his agreement to put aside considerations about whether he or Socrates is being refuted actually undermines his own view of Sophrosune. For in saying this, he agrees to detach his own view from the inquiry they are conducting. But his own conception of Sophrosune places the Sophron individual at the center as the supreme ruling knower, surrounded by epistemae that work toward his benefit. Such an image is in sharp tension with a philosophic detachment from one's interests in favor of finding the truth. I think this is further made clear by the small question Socrates asks. Turns out to be a huge question, but it looks small. He says, is Sophrosune also a knowledge of ignorance, if indeed it is a knowledge of knowledge? Right? That's 166e. The question sounds like the description of his own famous claim to knowledge of ignorance in the Apology. After provoking wonder about the refutation of Critias and Socrates, Socrates now explicitly brings to the conversation a notion which seems to be the very depiction of his own vision of self-knowledge. In doing it this way, he prepares us for a discussion of two conceptions of Sophrosune, the Critian and the Socratic. That there really are two images here has been suggested by the way Socrates induced Critias to bring self-knowledge into the discussion. Socrates had asked about the ignorance rather than the knowledge of an individual who does good things. That's back at 164a. But Critias leaves ignorance far behind. It is not until this moment that it is rekindled in the discussion. Critias's omission of ignorance is not merely accidental. For Critias, there are no limits to the wisdom he calls Sophrosune. So therefore, he has no robust sense of ignorance, of something outside of a limit. Socrates implies that the Sophron individual is open to what is beyond his limits, in that there is a recognition of what is beyond his knowledge. I think this calls for a different orientation to the good, for the knowledge of limits removes the individual from the center of his world. Rather than being elevated to the godlike center, human beings now properly stand in that in-between realm, the realm between beast and God, as was talked about this morning, right, in the symposium, the metaxu. The Socratic account of the good is not subordinated by one's own things. It is the neglect of the knowledge of ignorance, the elevation of ourselves to the gods, that seems to carry with it that confusion between one's own and the good. So when Critias agrees to Socrates' small addition, Socrates elaborates on an important activity that is essential to and unique to the individual who possesses Sophrosune so described. This individual, and only this individual, has self-knowledge and knowledge of others. And this is 167a. I won't read the whole quote, but he says, the one with Sophrosune is the only one who can examine another human being to determine what they know and what they don't know. And Critias agrees, but what? What has he agreed to? Does he himself know what he thinks he knows in agreeing with Socrates? Or has he instead assumed that his all-encompassing architectonic knowledge will also rule over Socrates' small addition and be able to accomplish the task Socrates assigns to it? I think there are reasons to suppose that the latter is the case. Socrates' elaboration here adds elements to the Critian vision of Sophrosune that have no proper place for them. In the Socratic account of the benefit of Sophrosune, the virtue renders one to genuinely enter a community, right? You had to just wait till this point. I'm getting to the conference theme, right? The virtue allows one into a koinonia with others. For the one with Sophrosune is able to not only examine himself, but also others in conversation. The Critian notion can't do that. It fails to give birth to an activity that would be part of community. Socrates is presenting an alternative vision of Sophrosune that is incompatible with the description put forth by Critias. While Critias describes an all-encompassing architectonic knowledge of knowledges, closed to what is beyond its limits because it dictates that there is nothing beyond its scope, Socrates' account claims the opposite. Sophrosune is, and here I'm quoting from the book on the Charmides by David Levine, an open self-knowledge not limited to one's own knowing situation. Moreover, Socrates has insisted that it is only the person with such knowledge of limits who will be able to examine himself and others. As I've suggested, that examination is remarkably parallel to Socrates' description of his own philosophical search in the Apology. So now I want to conclude. Let's return to the passage in which Socrates asks Critias about the common good, the Koinon Agathon. Okay, recall it was, do you not think it is for the common good almost of all men that how all the beings are should be discovered? While Critias agrees with Socrates that it would be for the common good of almost all men to disclose how all the beings are, his approach to this question ends up concealing the nature of Sophrosune. He ends up revealing that while he claims Sophrosune to be self-knowledge, he himself does not adequately possess self-knowledge, nor is he able to inquire in a way that would be for the common good. Critias's error is rooted in his thumatic nature and his unwillingness to admit ignorance, which is in sharp contrast to the erotic character of Socrates. It is ultimately fatal for Critias's position that he cannot overcome his thumos. He does not see past the distinction between what belongs to him, what is of another, a distinction that dictates what he believes to be good and bad. This leads him into incoherence, for his view of self-knowledge and his notion of the good are unbridgeable. The common good, then, that Socrates mentions here is fundamentally and essentially related to an acknowledgement of ignorance that motivates one to wonder at a good beyond one's love of one's own things. I want to suggest an explanation for the curious addition of almost, skedon, in Socrates' remark here. It's the common good for almost all men. Critias shows that unless he or his young cousin Charmides can admit ignorance and experience such wonder, then they are constitutionally not included in the common good. Such is the fate of the tyrant. In his attempt to delimit the good to what belongs to himself, he is cut off from the being of the common good, from a world beyond his own thumos. The self-knowledge of Critias, as knowledge of itself and all other knowledges, has nothing to do with a koinonia of human beings. If I understand Critian's self-knowledge correctly, he is putting forward the self-knowledge of the tyrant, a self-knowledge that mirrors the eventual political position of its adherent. Seeing nothing beyond itself, disconnected from what is beyond it, it ends up rendering its own being as meaningless. Plato's hope seems to be that Socratic Sophrosune, if it is essentially tied to an admission of ignorance and a search for wisdom, may reestablish the link to a koinonia with human beings that Critias's own vision renders void. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that interesting and wonderfully clear paper. And also thank you for being right on schedule. So we have 10 minutes for a few questions. The easiest would be if you just use the raise your hand feature. If you don't know how to use that, then at the risk of exposing your lack of technical know-how, physically raise your hand and I'll try to see it. and keep track. So let me see. Now I'm exhibiting my lack of technical know-how. I'm just trying to see everybody here. Trying to get all the screens on my screen at once. I think I see one question, which is Will's question. So Will, you can go ahead.
So Alan, great paper, and also bodes extremely well for the book that we were discussing. And I wanna focus my question not just on what you said about the Charmides, but also make a nod to the Symposium and the Republic, which are crucial to your book. But first of all, just a note of praise. I think that idea of the triumph of thumos over eros, using the passage with Charmides and the actor, that is a wonderful. That's a wonderful way to advance your thesis. And the way you bring tyranny out at the end is really compelling, because I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop and you to mention tyranny, because it's really the failure to look at alterity. And that's basically what my question is about, is alterity shading into altruism? It is that the late appearance of tyranny in your talk made it all the more powerful. So look, what I want to ask you about, I understand the thumotic route that you're taking, and I think, as I said, I think it's really good. But I'd like you to discuss more the image of the doctor. And I'll throw a little Gorgias in too. It seems to me that the great doctor, well, I mean, you got a million doctor passages, and you mentioned Levine, so that's all the way through it. But the doctor passage where the doctor cannot have sophrosine unless the doctor knows that she is benefiting herself. Which is a complete lack of alterity, which is going to be formally repudiated in Republic I, where, you know, any true techne doesn't look for its own good, but the good of that over which it presides. And then mediated by the Gorgias, of course, where the doctor in front of the jury of children is clearly trying to benefit somebody with an absolute knowledge that that the doctor is not benefiting herself. She's going to be lynched by the jury of children, as, you know, misled by the pastry chef. So I'm just wondering, since your talk beautifully emphasized the beyond, the metaxu, the other, and you know, I mean, it seemed to me that Alan, I don't know if this would interest you, but that the real key to the reason Plato really doesn't have to say much about the idea of the good is because it's not the good for you. It's not the purely selfish eudaimonistic good of which Critias is the kind of it seems to me does a reductio ad tyrannidem on that, and that's what your paper brings out. So, but what I'm asking you, Alan, is how you feel about the status of techne. It is whether or that the problem in the Charmides is that Critias's notion of what sophrosine would be is not only self-reflexive, but that it needs to benefit him, mm-hmm. and that is exactly what Plato is trying to get us to overcome, and therefore formally repudiates it in the Republic. I'm just wondering if you could use that. It seems to me that it completely supports your argument. So I'm wondering if you see it that way.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Will. Thank you very much for the kind things you said about the paper. I had it in my mind. I hope Will likes this.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to do the symposium thing just briefly.
Oh, okay.
Is that, of course, because you said you were going to do the Aristophanes thing, is right. That, you know, that oikoitos, where it's kind of the recovery of the self, is continuing to put you in that lack of alterity. So, I mean, that it just seems that alterity idea would really work for you. By the way, just a note for the hosts, could you guys enable the chat here? Because it's impossible to communicate even with everyone right now, the way the chat is configured. Anyway, go ahead, Alan. I'm sorry.
Notice that. Yeah, thanks. I think that's right. I think, and I think I want to say exactly what you said as you started out, which tyranny is the failure to look at alterity. And then that does leave us in a funny position. I'll get to techne in a moment. It doesn't seem like there's this thing called self-consciousness as there is, at some point in modernity. Let's just blame Descartes. It becomes about the self looking at itself, and that it's that notion that I think is very much being rejected here. You do not have a self without alterity, and so the tyrant ends up destroying himself by basically alienating everything that is outside of him. What's interesting about techne is, I come from a tradition in which really is suspicious of the techne analogy, but in a certain way, as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking, and I have to give this much more thought. Techne is actually better. Tom Schmidt wrote this book, right, where it's just like clearly the Charmides is attacking techne. And he makes a very compelling arguments for all this. On the other hand, techne, by their very constitution, point outside of themselves, right, at a distinct object. And so in that regard, maybe techne is a better model than this kind of strange reflexivity that Critias wants to introduce. As regarding the Republic and the Symposium, I think that's absolutely right. I think the Republic is picking this up and refuting it from another angle, but also trying to say, this requires the book that I have to write, but it's thumos disguised as eros. And that's really what I want to say about Aristophanes. The speech Aristophanes gives about eros, as you point out, is about one's own. It is ultimately a speech about thumos, and thumos pushed to that extreme is ultimately unsatisfying to us. What we're grasping for when we're grasping for that other who is just like us is actually an unconscious desire to go beyond myself, and that's diatema, right? So I don't know. We should obviously talk at greater length.
Does anyone have a quick question?
Excellent.
We have just a couple minutes, 3 minutes left or so. Anyone have a quick question to ask? If not, we can just move on. Ed?
I think Ed has a question.
Yeah, Ed, go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for the paper. It's very interesting. I'm just a couple things to pick up on what you said and maybe push you a little further. The first is that in the Republic, the person with thumos is sort of like a dog. All he needs to do is recognize the opinion, and Critias is sort of like that. He's got following your image here. He's got the opinion, and he probably got it from Socrates, because what he's saying is very much like what we see in the Republic. So it's kind of a play on Socrates refuting himself. But for Critias, it's just an opinion. And Socrates, the erotic character, the person with eros always wants to know the beloved and to explore the beloved. And that's what Critias is lacking, as I think you showed very nicely. But the second quick point is I'm not sure that you're not backwards on this. With Critias if he's thumotic, he's interested in controlling other people. This is a science of rule. It's the way he describes Sophrosune. It's the terms that are later applied to metaphysics. Knowledge of it's this reflexive knowledge of itself. And it also knows everything else. It's a ruling science. And the problem with him is that he thinks he can just control everything without having any knowledge of any particular object. And so in a way, it seems to me you could make a case it's the opposite of what you're suggesting, that the thumotic is interested in the other. He wants recognition from the other person.
Yeah,
that's what He doesn't have any basis for that because he doesn't have any knowledge. Doesn't have anything that belongs to him.
Yeah.
And that's what Socrates is kind of urging to do. Well, thanks for the
That's
paper.
nice. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm gonna try sticking to the idea that the thumatic is, you know, with the oikeon for as long as I can. But I definitely I think you're right that Critias is about controlling others. One way, maybe one reaction I have to this is the way Critias expresses his control for others is to kind of assimilate them to himself, right? To make that which is genuinely other is either of no concern or threatening to Critias. So while it, in a way, Critias does not, I would say Critias does not see Charmides as other, but as kind of reflection of himself. That's why it's like that poet image, right? The poet and the work, the author and the work. It's sort of, the poem is not an other to me, the way when Critias is talking about it. If Socrates were writing it, he would say, no, yeah, the poem is, because I'm inspired by something beyond, but that's not Critias. So that's one thing, but I have to think more about it. I think the dog comment is right on. What's interesting about Critias, and this is all Republic, right? He's a dog who is in danger of being a wolf, right?
Good, yeah.
Yeah.
More than
Okay, well,
yeah.
well, to keep on schedule, we have to move ahead, and so after that paper from the U.S., now begins the takeover of the session by the Canadians of the University of Ottawa, to whom I am myself somewhat partial. But don't worry, the session will be saved for Latin America at the end by Lucas. So we turn now to Fabien Caillé, who will speak on rhetoric and responsibility in Plato's Clitophon. So
excellent, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah. It's
Great.
a little, I think it's okay.
Okay, I will change the audio second. 1 second.
A bit computer sounding, like robot sounding, but
okay.
I think we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I don't know how to fix the robot sounding. Maybe that's just my voice. I don't know. But in any case, so I am presenting on the Clitophon. It's a dialogue that most people don't read. Unfortunately, it's quite important to kind of set the stage. I do have a handout that I have here. I'll put it in the chat just so everyone can follow along if they wish. It's not essential, but it might be helpful to some people. It just has a bunch of like quotes on it mostly. Okay. Why are you? Okay, maybe it doesn't want to attach. Never mind. It's not essential. I'll move on. Okay, so get my file up here. So there's a tendency in Plato scholarship to treat Plato and Socrates as united in mind and action in some way. It is thought that the Socratic life is the Platonic ideal, and that Plato himself, as the author of Socrates' defense speech, must endorse the words he attributes to his mentor there, that to question the Athenians about their sincere beliefs concerning justice and piety and courage and all of the other virtues is the great and most divine gift for the city. But it is worth recognizing that Plato himself isn't doing this. He's not following the Socratic life. He does not question his countrymen like Socrates does. He is an author. He does not loiter in public, searching for young boys to question. He rather spends his life provoking others with his pen. And while scholars have increasingly appreciated the significance of writing for Plato's philosophy, sorry, I've lost my place. While scholars have increasingly appreciated the significance of writing for Plato's philosophy, they have been slower to recognize its implications for Plato's relationship to Socrates. No longer can scholars naively accept that Plato straightforwardly endorses the arguments, allusions, and images that he himself marshals in favor of Socratic dialectic, for if he did, his activity would not differ from Socrates. He too would haunt the gymnasia and the marketplace and the other public spaces of Athens. That he does not shows that he's found at least some way to reject or reinterpret Socratic dialectic. And I propose in this essay that Plato explicitly does this in the Clitophon, one of the very few dialogues where there's an explicit criticism of Socrates. So he there tells the story of Clitophon the statesman, who, having overheard Socrates in conversation, has been persuaded by him and exhorted to the pursuit of virtue, and specifically justice. He tells Socrates that he wished to submit to his teaching, only to later discover that despite his exhortations, Socrates either does not or cannot teach justice. Clitophon exhorts Socrates to teach him justice and threatens, if he does not, to leave his company, leave Socrates' company for the sake of his intercourse with Thrasymachus, who promises to teach justice, where Socrates does not. The story is deceptively simple. Despite its brevity, the Clitophon is filled with allusions and symbolism, and Plato's focus transcends the merely pedagogical dispute between Clitophon and Socrates and targets the communal and political responsibilities of philosophy and the philosopher. This is something that most scholarship on my appraisal has mostly ignored. So he shows that Socrates, by philosophizing in the way he does, is incapable of responsibly addressing the community he intends to serve. He can only, at best, exhort individuals to leave behind their alien community and search for justice. He cannot address the community's ailment in itself. Plato, on the other hand, can. By turning to written dialectic, Plato is able not only to exhort individuals to pursue justice, but also provoke the community as a community to that same pursuit. So I developed this argument in roughly 3 stages. I say roughly because they're intermixed in a bit. So I begin in section 1 with a brief exposition of the contours and themes of the Clitophon. My focus there is mostly the meaning and significance of Clitophon's criticism in the dialogue, and not just the dialogue as a whole. In section 2, I turn to what is essentially Plato's criticism. And I show that in his Charity, Clitophon mistakes Socrates' much more serious fault that Plato identifies. Because Socrates is himself ignorant of justice by exhorting others, such as Clitophon, to its pursuit, Socrates runs afoul of his own exhortative arguments. So he not only risks doing harm, he actively harms, and Clitophon is the one who he has harmed. And then finally, in section 3, I show how Plato avoids the same harm in his own philosophical practice by addressing the community. And it's not just a philosophical community, but the community as a whole in the sense of the Athenian polis. So we'll start off in section 1. So Plato wastes no time in setting the tone for the Clitophon. It opens in the formal, impartial language of the courts. So it starts in my translation, which is probably bad. Clitophon, son of Aristonymus, it was described to us just now, criticizes in conversation with Lysias the time he spent associating with Socrates and greatly praises his intercourse with Thrasymachus. And there's a lot going on in that first opening accusation. So first of all, it is an accusation. Socrates is accused of 2 distinct injustices. Socrates accuses him first of criticizing tasmen meta Socrates diatribas, his participation in Socrates' occupation or pastime. Clitophon is not accused of criticizing Socrates like Meletus or Lycon or Anudis did in the Apology from the outside, as people who aren't themselves engaged in the pursuit of justice. He's rather accused of criticizing the close connection that he and Socrates shared in their mutual pursuit of justice. Second, Socrates accuses Clitophon of greatly praising Thrasymachus de Sunesian, his intercourse with Thrasymachus. So not only has Clitophon said bad things about Socrates and his philosophy, but he is also favorably engaged in intercourse with one of Socrates' competitors. So Clitophon has, in a word, betrayed Socrates or cheated on him, in a sense. So in order to actually appreciate what's really going on in that first accusation, I think we need to understand to some degree who the characters are. So we have Clitophon and Socrates, of course, but there's also 2 other names. There's Lysias and there's Thrasymachus. Clitophon is really the only one that we don't know a whole lot about, but both Thucydides and Aristotle or pseudo-Aristotle say of Clitophon that he was a more or less conservative politician, a consistent defender of the Athenian constitution, or the ancestral constitution, of Athens. And he was an ally of Theramenes and Anudis, who were kind of a moderate oligarchs during the period of the 30 tyrants for the most part, and later alienated, of course, by the other 30 tyrants. So as political contributions, which is what Aristotle's and Thucydides focuses on, is that Clitophon is attributed with the what later became known as the decisive move to the Council of 400, this coup that happened in 411, basically. So they overturned the democracy very briefly, and Clitophon is essentially blamed for that. It's not that he did the coup himself, but in his he put a rider on a motion to investigate the ancestral constitution, and that investigation, in some sense, started this whole move towards oligarchy. Now, Clitophon really only appears in the Clitophon, but he also appears in the Republic, and very often scholars of the Clitophon will focus a lot more on what he says in the Republic and attribute that to Clitophon as a person. So what he says in the Republic, addressing what Thrasymachus is trying to argue, he accuses Thrasymachus of being a kind of relativist. That what Thrasymachus actually means is that justice is what the tyrant believes to be in his interest, not what is actually in his interest. And most scholars have attributed that view to Clitophon, that Clitophon is himself a legal positivist. Given the context of the conversation in Republic Book 1, I don't think you can make that attribution. I think what is probably going on is Clitophon, as a conservative Athenian statesman, is accusing Thrasymachus of being the kind of caricature of the sophist that we often find in, for example, Aristophanes. So what we should, I want to kind of stick to the things that we actually know about Clitophon in my interpretation here, which is to say that it's kind of strange that he even appears with Socrates and Lysias and Thrasymachus in the first place, because of his antecedent political leanings. So Lysias, of course, to understand that, is a famous medic and orator. He's a staunch Democrat. He financed the democratic resistance to the 30 tyrants, which also ultimately restored the democratic rule in Athens. That's well known. Lysias is a constant feature in many of Plato's dialogues. We all, of course, know Socrates. He's the philosopher. He spent his life persuading and reproaching his fellow Athenians about justice and virtue, etc. He was executed mostly by Meletus and Anutus, who were allies of Clitophon. And Thrasymachus is the prominent sophist of the 5th century, and he made several important contributions to rhetoric, a known associate of Lysias, etc. He came to Athens as a diplomat from Chalcedon in 407, but probably earlier as a teacher of wisdom. He would have been well known. And as Plato attributes to him in the Republic, he's not a relativist. So what's going on given those characters? I think there's kind of a decisive fiction in that first accusation. And Plato illustrates that with Clitophon's immediate response by saying that this legal language is kind of inappropriate. Clitophon and Socrates are alone. There's no prosecution, there's no jury, there's nothing, there's no court. So why the legal language? Well, it can't be because Socrates is a kind of judicial or judicious statesmanly person, because Socrates didn't participate in the courts. So there's something else going on. And I think that something else is to say that Clitophon isn't just Clitophon. He's, in a sense, a symbol of his occupation. And because Socrates is accusing Clitophon of criticizing Socrates' occupation, there's that kind of focus. So there is Clitophon as the individual throughout the dialogue, but we should also focus on Clitophon and Socrates and Lysias and Thrasymachus as occupations. And in that sense, there's a kind of like history going on in that first accusation. So Socrates as philosophy is accusing Clitophon as statesmanship in his association with oratory, or Lysias, of essentially criticizing philosophy and praising sophistry. So we can see over the history of Athens, for example, the ancestral constitution, the thing that Clitophon is so praising, in some sense degrading itself with oratory and sophistry. and moving away from the philosophy that's not represented by Socrates, because obviously he wasn't alive in the 6th century, but that of, for example, Solon or Cleisthenes, people who were recognized as wise men of their day or as sages. And a lot of the images later on in the Clitophon will kind of reflect back onto this, where the things that Clitophon attributes to Socrates are much better attributed to Solon or to Cleisthenes than they are to actually to Socrates himself. But that history is kind of supposed to be in the background. I think what's the rest of the dialogue kind of more or less ignores it. It just makes constant allusions back to it. So what does Clitophon say in response to the accusation? So I'll just read the quotation here. This is his response. "Whoever told you that, Socrates, whoever told you that he was slandering Socrates' occupation and praising Thrasymachus, misrepresented what I said to Lysias about you. Though it's true I didn't praise you for some things, I did praise you for others. Since you're obviously scolding me right now, though you're pretending that you don't care, I'd be very glad to tell you myself what I said, especially since we happen to find ourselves alone. So you won't readily suppose that I have anything against you. In fact, you probably didn't hear the truth, which is why I think you're being needlessly hard on me. So if you let me speak freely, I'd gladly do so. I want to tell you what I said." So in other words, the Clitophon is a defense against Socrates' accusation. It's kind of a reverse of Socrates' apology. So I think a lot of the themes from Socrates' apology are also applying here. And Socrates, of course, responds in the way Socrates often does. "By all means, it would be shameful for me not to submit to you when your intention is to help me. For clearly, once I know my good and bad points, I will make it my practice to pursue and develop the former, while ridding myself of the latter to the extent that I am able." Now, it's notable, given that Socrates is going to go and criticize, or that Clitophon is going to go and criticize Socrates, that you have this admission by Socrates that he's just going to pursue the good things and get rid of the bad things as much as he can, when Socrates never changed his mode of life. I think that's a statement more or less by Plato, that insofar as these criticisms are accurate, that philosophers in his day, following Socrates' death, should revise their practice. So what does Clitophon then say? What are the good things and what are the bad things? Clitophon starts with the good things. So he says, "You appeared to me to rise above all other men with your magnificent speeches, when you reproached mankind and like a god suspended above the tragic stage, chanted the following refrain." And again, this is another thing much closer to Solon than anything Socrates ever did. Socrates did not ever speak on the tragic stage. We have this allusion in possibly to Aristophanes, but that's a comic stage. The tragic stage might be an allusion to Athena, who knows? But the things that he attributes to Socrates are very Socratic. So he reproaches people for caring too much about wealth and not about their sons, not about their souls, etc. The major argument in the praise, I'm skipping over a lot because I don't have that much time, is that where Clitophon says, I dare say I never objected, nor I believe ever will object to these arguments, nor to many other eloquent ones like them. I consider them to be extremely beneficial and extremely effective in turning us in the right direction. They can really rouse us as if we'd been sleeping. Again, another allusion to the apology, the gadfly image. So your speech delivers a noble conclusion that someone who doesn't know how to use his soul is better off putting his soul to rest and not living at all, rather than leading a life in which his actions are based on nothing but personal whim. If for some reason he must live, it would be better for such a man to live as a slave than to be free, handing over the rudder of his mind, like that of a ship, to someone else who knows that skill of steering men, which you, Socrates, often call politics. That very same skill you say as the judicial skill and justice. So this is the thing that is really the keystone of Clitophon's praise, where this is why it's important to pursue justice. Without justice, you're a worthless person. You probably shouldn't even live at all. And if you must live, you have to submit to someone who knows justice, who, in other words, knows how to put your body and your mind to good use. But in following that conclusion, Clitophon says, well, that would be wonderful to know. I want to submit to you, Socrates, as someone who knows, in order that I too can learn justice. and use my body and my mind in the right kind of way. But Socrates doesn't tell Clitophon justice, so Clitophon must kind of follow him around and question him until he learns, or until he at least shows Socrates that he's adequately prepared to learn justice. So he starts by talking not to Socrates, but to Socrates' associates. And his invocation of the associates shows that he's not one of them in some sense. He doesn't know what to call them, his friends or associates or whatever we want to call them, he says. So what does he say to the associates? Well, he puts the matter somewhat like Socrates' own, he says, and he questions the associates what we should think justice is. It can't be something that just provokes other or exhorts other people to pursue justice. It has to have its own end in itself that it's actually searching for. So he makes the analogy, as is very common, to the doctor, where the doctor is not just teaching people how to be doctors, but it's also the medical techne is also after health. What is that same thing with justice? And Socrates' associates can't answer. They have a little debate, and someone who's clever gives a proposal, and that proposal ends up going to be circular. And in the end, Clitophon is dissatisfied. He still doesn't know what justice is. Socrates clearly hasn't taught his own associates, despite that he thinks that they are the best and most special people that he knows. So Clitophon then goes to Socrates himself. And Socrates tells him, as Clitophon says, that the aim of justice is to hurt one's enemies and to help one's friends. But later it turned out that the just man never harms anyone, since everything he does is for the benefit of all. Now, it's notable that that's not Socrates' view in any of the other dialogues. That's something that Socrates, in fact, refutes in the Republic and other places. But it is Solon's view, which, again, is another allusion to this kind of occupational, like more abstract or symbolic drama that's going on in the dialogue. But perhaps we can understand that as something that in their mutual conversation, Socrates has proposed as an hypothesis and was later refuted, and Clitophon perhaps is just misunderstanding what's going on. But at the very least, Clitophon has been dissatisfied. He questions Socrates again and again and again, and he never gets any closer to justice. So he comes to the conclusion, he says, that while you're better than anyone at turning a man towards the pursuit of virtue, one of two things must be the case. Either this is all you can do and nothing more, as might happen with any other skill. For example, when someone who's not a pilot rehearses a speech in praise of the pilot's skill as being something of great worth to men, the same could also be done for any other skill. And someone might accuse you of being in the same position with justice, that your ability to praise it so well does not make you any more knowledgeable about it. Now, that's not my own view. Meaning that he thinks that Socrates does possess knowledge of justice. But there are only two possibilities. Either you don't know it or you don't wish to share it with me. And he ends his defense speech essentially with this kind of criticism that there's those two options. And if you know it, Socrates, as I think you do, please share it with me. I will do all of the things that I need to do to show you that I'm ready to learn justice. Or at least just accept that I have, or that I've already done them. And look, here's all of the evidence. I talked to your associates, I talked to you, I clearly am ready. And if you don't do that, I'm going to go after Thrasymachus, and I'm going to learn justice from him. And Socrates does not respond. That's just the end of the dialogue. I don't think there's a problem with that. Socrates said at the beginning that he just wants to hear the good and bad points, and he will modify his practice. He doesn't wish to sit here and debate with Clitophon what justice is. But that does kind of invite the reader, as a reader, to ask what's going on. And there is a criticism, I think, moving into section 2, there is a criticism that Clitophon doesn't attribute to Socrates. And I think he doesn't do that because he's being charitable to Socrates. He doesn't think that Socrates is ignorant of justice. And why doesn't he think that? Well, to accuse someone of being ignorant of justice is to say that they're unjust in some way. that they're actually doing something wrong. And given what Socrates' own view is, that the unjust person is better off not living or not putting their soul to use, or submitting to someone who knows, well, Socrates doesn't appear to submit to anyone like that, so he must know, or else he's being hypocritical and possibly should just go die, in a phrase. So that's a charitable argument. The problem is that Socrates is in fact ignorant of justice. This is something he reiterates all the time, that Clitophon doesn't recognize this or doesn't appreciate it. Might be that he's just assuming that Clitophon is being ironic in conversation, or he's just not that close with Socrates at all and doesn't actually know what that means or has never heard it before. So what exactly is the argument that Plato is giving, not that Clitophon in his charity is giving to Socrates? So the criticism is much more damning than anything Clitophon presents. And the criticism really starts with Clitophon's praise, essentially. So that Socrates doesn't possess knowledge of justice, he doesn't know, means in some sense that he risks doing harm. And this is an argument that Emily Austin has recently presented in the Euthydemus, which some scholars, such as Francisco Gonzalez right before us, have linked in some ways to the Clitophon. And Emily Austin herself recognizes that this is the same argument. And the argument basically goes like this. Premise one, if one lacks wisdom, having and using conditional goods risks more harm than benefit. Premise two, philosophical talent and activity are conditional goods. Premise three, Socrates lacks wisdom, and therefore, the conclusion, Socrates' philosophical talent and activity risks more harm than benefit. So if this argument goes through, you essentially have the view given by Plato that maybe you shouldn't actually be doing philosophy unless you have knowledge of justice, unless you're wise in some way. It's a weird view for someone like Plato to promote, you'd think, because Plato himself is still pursuing philosophy. He's still pursuing justice. He is using his own philosophical talent and activity to pursue the things that Socrates is, or so we think. Now, one way to understand this is one given by Gonzalez himself, which is to say that justice is not something that's in some sense distinct from the pursuit of justice. The justice just is the pursuit of justice. It's not a techne, but rather a state of possession in some sense. So if that's the case, then the pursuit of justice, philosophy, is not a conditional good in Austin's sense, but it's an unconditional good. So, and Gonzalez uses the evidence of the Euthydemus to kind of fold back on the Clitophon in the same way. So in the Euthydemus, you have Clinias, who, having been exhorted to pursue justice, then takes over the conversation and shows just how prepared he actually is to lead the conversation and actually make some important contributions. And Clitophon does the same thing with Socrates' associates. So Socrates has succeeded already in teaching Clitophon justice, teaching in quotation marks, to the extent that he has succeeded in exhorting him to the pursuit of justice. Now that to the extent that is really important, because as the rest of the Clitophon shows, Clitophon clearly kind of gives up that pursuit. He gets frustrated with Socrates, that Socrates has not taught him justice, and he goes after Thrasymachus, and in some sense might be corrupted in that sense. And there are other characters that are just like that. Alcibiades, for example, who is only ever just and turns his mind in the right way in Socrates' company. Apart from Socrates, he goes off and does the life of pleasure, basically. So what should we say about these arguments? Should we assess Gonzalez's argument as a proper refutation of Austin? I don't think that it does refute it in a sense. I think both views can be reconciled in a sense. So both Austin's and Gonzalez's arguments are reconciled if we properly attend to the evaluative context. This is why it's important that we separate the personalities or the characters, Clitophon and Socrates, from the occupations of statesmanship and philosophy and oratory and sophistry. So Plato shows that Socrates as an individual not only risks but actively causes harm by exhorting Clitophon as an individual to the pursuit of justice without further guiding him. Whereas philosophy as a profession doesn't necessarily do that. So in its connection with statesmanship, it has never caused harm in that kind of way. It's something about Socrates' personal philosophical practice that's doing this. And can we say that Socrates is actually saying this can we say that Plato is actually saying this of Socrates? Well, in the Republic, he makes noises in this direction. So at 538C to 539A, he says, kind of in passing, more or less, that we hold from childhood certain convictions about just and fine things. We're brought up with them as our parents, or as with our parents. We obey and honor them. There are other ways of living, however, opposite of these, and full of pleasures that flatter the soul and attract it to themselves, but which don't persuade sensible people. We continue to honor and obey the convictions of their fathers. And then a questioner comes along, namely Socrates, and asks someone of this sort, what is the fine? Again, something Socrates does. And when he answers that he has what he has heard from the traditional lawgivers, such as Solon, the argument refutes him. And by refuting him, often and in many places, shakes him from his convictions and makes him believe that the fine is no more fine than the shameful, and the same with the just, the good, and the things he honored most. Then, when he no longer honors and obeys those convictions and can't discover the true ones, will he be likely to adopt any other way of life than that which flatters him? And so, I suppose, from being lawful, he becomes lawless. So is this the kind of thing that Socrates is doing with Clitophon? And I suggest that it probably is. That Socrates as an individual is in some sense tearing Clitophon away from his community and giving him a life that's kind of alien to justice, to the proper order of the polis. However, where the community is exhorted to pursue justice, no similar harm would obtain. So Plato, in some sense, is saying that in doing dialectic to the individual and not to the community, you're doing something unjust. And Socrates, in his lack of knowledge of justice, doesn't recognize this. Whereas Plato is going to kind of reverse this and in his writing addresses the community. So he doesn't just exhort individuals to pursuit of justice. He also exhorts the community. So section 3. So what written dialectic does, essentially. So we can revise the Socratic project. Plato is not rejecting it. He still thinks that we should exhort people to the pursuit of justice. He just wants to change how he's doing this, essentially. So Plato recognizes that the state of each individual soul depends upon the state of the community of which it's part. That's the real move from Socrates to Plato. And it's irresponsible to address the individual and not the community. So Plato writes instead of haunting the marketplace or haunting the gymnasia. And in that way, doesn't separate people from the community. Now, it's notable that some scholars, such as Josiah Ober, have argued that Plato actually fully retreats from the community or from the polis in order to found a different philosophical community. So Josiah Ober basically says that in Plato's difference from Socrates, Plato is in some sense debasing himself. So he's no longer holding up the gadfly ethics that Socrates promotes in the Apology and the Crito, which require that the law be obeyed to the extent that it's open to persuasion as to the nature of justice. Ober shows, or he thinks, that Plato denies that the law can be persuaded, that the political community is open to persuasion by philosophy because of the deeply entrenched demotic ideology. And he appeals to the Gorgias and the Republic for this. And therefore, Ober argues that Plato himself need not obey the Athenian law. He can completely divorce himself from the polis, from the political community, and retreats from public life to the academy to construct a philosophical community opposed to the Athenian polis, and Ober suggests possibly to eventually usurp it. That Plato hasn't done this is irrelevant. However, this kind of move away from the polis is told against or countered by the very evidence of Plato's writing in the first place. Why would Plato write if he's not writing for the public in some way? Plato was well aware that pieces of writing, as he shows in the Phaedrus, can be divorced from the author and just shared around independently of any community that is supposed to address. And Danielle Allen, as another person, has shown that Plato had a noticeable effect on the political debates of the 4th century. There are a couple concepts that make their first appearance in Plato that later appear in the speeches of notable orators that have survived to us, to the present period. And in the Clitophon, you have a real Platonic response to something like what Ober is getting at. So the Clitophon shows not just that the law cannot be persuaded, but that Socrates' method of doing so is the thing that's wrong. It's not that the law is unpersuadable, it's that it's just not being persuaded. And it's not being persuaded because Socrates isn't trying to persuade it. Whereas Plato addresses the community. He addresses the law and the political community head on, essentially. He's not going in as an orator in the assembly or the courts, but he's in some sense competing with the established democratic means of communication, like comedy, like tragedy, like oratory, or epideictic oratory, etc., that already exist in the community. And you can see this competition in the kind of protreptic and apotreptic that exists in most of Plato's dialogues, including in the Clitophon. So what Plato is doing is not separating, to conclude, is not separating the philosophical community from the political community, but rather he's addressing the Athenian political community made philosophical. He's trying to essentially assert philosophy in the political community. That's it.
Okay,
That's
thank you. Thank you very much for that, Fabien. Okay, we just have like 3 minutes for questions, so they're gonna have to be very, very brief. And I won't defend myself. I'll just say what Socrates said in the Clitophon and just learn from you my good points and my bad points. But I guess, William, brief.
Thank you, Fabien. I've written extensively about the Clitophon, and you might want to look at that. One of the things you never mentioned is that it was very obvious to Thrasyllus, it's very obvious to me, that Socrates replies to the Clitophon in a little book called The Republic, and that's why Clitophon appears in both. There were a couple of historical things. You did quote the ancestral constitution, but what Aristotle says in the Constitution of the Athenians is that the amendment was designed to show that Cleisthenes, the great Democrat, was part of the Athenian constitution, which goes directly against the oligarchical position, directly against it. And what I really want to drive at is and this is why Raoul did a great job in organizing this conference, is that your paper really relates very closely to Allen's paper, it seems to me. First of all, by presenting him as an ally of Theramenes, that Clitophon is the opposite of Critias. So that if Allen is correct that there's a lack of alterity in Critias, who, by the way, along with Nicias, might easily be those two nameless people that Clitophon has been interrogating, that would support it. When you did the little thing, friend and enemies, you said that's something Socrates never says, as if to poo-poo it. Remember that Socrates also never says the thing that you also quoted, which is that you should do everything for the benefit of everybody. It's the most sublime statement of altruism in the Platonic dialogues. And of course, to go with Ober and say that Plato is a political quiescent guy when he's about to send the philosophers back down into the cave is cuckoo. And I take it that Clitophon is one of the guys that does go back down into the cave, as Theramenes does, and gets murdered by Critias, the archetypal tyrant. The question I want to ask you is, which we don't have time for, because we had 3 minutes for a question, is the last lines, the very last words. Because remember, what he says is that if one is really pursuing virtue to its end, to teleion aretein, that you're an absolute impediment to eudaimonia. And this to me is the core of why the Clitophon is an authentic dialogue, because the eudaimonia, as it came out with Allen, that's a completely self-contained solipsistic good, as opposed to an other, that Socrates, as demonstrated in the Republic, really is an obstacle to eudaimonia as the good. And that's why Clitophon prepares for Republic. Thank you for your paper and for taking the Clitophon seriously. Great to see, and I hope you, if you take a look at my book, I'd love to hear your responses.
Okay, Fabien, quick response or just acceptance or?
Thank you. I have read some of your thing. I haven't read your full book yet, so I have to get back to you on that one. But yeah, there's a lot going on in the Clitophon. I don't think it's necessarily a preparation for the Republic. I think it's in some sense an answer to the Apology. But I mean, my view is not really fixed on this. So I mean, it can change. There's lots of different intertextual connections between the Clitophon and a bunch of other things too. So it's worth sorting them out.
By the way,
no more. We have William. That's enough. We have there's one more hand. We're out of time, but there is one more hand. So I would like to get another voice in, if it could be very quick. I see Martin Sitta, I think, or no?
Okay, very briefly, you're perfectly right that it's a counter apology, as it were. But you leave off one of the things that you mentioned at the end, namely that Socrates might not want to answer, that he's holding back an answer. And the obvious question is why? One possible answer is that at the beginning, he just says, I heard, that you've been saying things about me. And Clitophon immediately takes that, you think I've been attacking you and I've got to defend myself. One thing Socrates does not do, he does indeed, is not defend himself, i.e. not act as though defending yourself is one of the most important things. Perhaps it's even an act of justice not to, under certain circumstances. Justice does not depend on just trying to prevail in the trial. Justice depends on being right. So his act is, in a way, a just act of showing Clitophon that it's not necessary just to jump up to defend oneself. Could that be a possible explanation?
Yeah, that's really good. I hadn't thought of that. So thank you. I'm going to investigate that myself in the coming time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's move on then to our next Ottawan, Sarah Feldman, who will speak on Micro-Koinōniai and their failure in the Crito. And Sarah, just because the time here, thing is a bit confusing. So you have till 6:32. So try to just and so leave that means 6:22 if you want to have 10 minutes of discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I've sent everyone. I can't. As Fabien says, you can't put it in the chat. I've sent everyone a handout with a couple of passages that I'm looking at in detail from the Crito. I want to apologize because I did it quickly and I just did a cut and paste of Harold North Fowler's terrible, or just, very, yes, I'm not on board with that translation. But the text has just burned it. So that's in your email if you want to because I just did a mass email. Okay. So first of all, I want to join my colleagues in thanking the organizers for framing what looks like a really rich series of discussions. This paper has received quite a lot of help and feedback from unnamed professors, as well as a lot of my I'm flattering Professor Gonzalez because he's on my thesis committee, and so I'm gonna be defending. Sorry. But also like a lot of conversations with my peers that which have undermined in practice, at least, the pessimistic view that this paper is going to take on dialogue between clashing perspectives. So I'm going to be working with the conception of koinonia derived from a key passage in Plato's Crito, which I think offers some helpful clues for making sense of the structure and function of clashing perspectives found in the dialogue. By the way, if you can't hear me, or if just say something in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on that. This key passage, which runs from 449 CDE, supports a model of perspective that emphasizes the notion of a bedrock commitment that both gives rise to and is interpreted through a network of beliefs, desires, and modes of thinking and reasoning. In other words, what I'm going to understand is a perspective. It establishes preconditions for koinonia, which are at the same time the preconditions for the give it and take a meaningful discussion. I'll call a relation in which these preconditions are satisfied dialogic koinonia. In this paper, I aim to show that in the Crito, the failure of dialogic koinonia serves for the audience to draw attention to the failure of dialogic koinonia within the audience's own souls. In other words, the absence of the internal coherence necessary for the formation of judgments through rational and consistent reflection. Specifically, the dialogue offers an external expression of incompatible perspectives that are already implicit in the audience's internal lives. The value conflict, I suggest, looks like a form of elenkos broadly construed, yet this elenkos is slightly different from the traditional variety. First, it is a form of elenkos through which Plato guides the audience, rather than one through which Socrates guides his interlocutor. Second, unlike the form of elenkos that aims specifically at the recognition of two conflicting beliefs, this elenkos concerns the conflict between perspectives in a broad sense, that is, not merely beliefs and judgments, but the effective and desiderative attachments with which they are bound up. In other words, the conflict is evoked on multiple levels, with the result that the audience cannot simply lay it aside as a logical or semantic game. Third, the external elenkos of the dialogue, the one portrayed within the dialogue itself, there's more than one elenkos going on there, but one of them, I think, leads to the apparatic recognition of the inability to engage in meaningful discussion. This mirrors the internal experience of an audience led to doubt its own capacity to arrive at judgments through consistent affirmation or denial of a given statement. Yet the recognition of the fundamental schism between perspectives may not mean abandoning any hope of achieving koinonia through dialogue broadly construed this time. That's because the recognition is arrived at through a structured elenkos-style process that does not depend upon a commitment to our capacity to follow the basic rules of rational discourse. I will very briefly touch upon ways in which an elenkos of this kind may eventually lead towards establishing a basis for dialogic koinonia. I've taken this part as my inspiration for this paper, Alexandru Ovidius Garcia's, I'm mangled that, I'm sorry, concept of the soul as Micro-Koinōniai, in which is reflected the Macro-Koinonia of the polis, the different sub-communities with their different perspectives. And again, perspective understood as a set of interconnected values, beliefs, modes of speech, and thought. For instance, the subcommunity of the oikos in the symposium might be associated with primary commitment to what I'm calling, broadly speaking, kinship and ethics. So primary commitment to friends and kin, perspective in which modes of thinking, beliefs, and values are highly relational and context sensitive and shifting in order to achieve the appropriate fit for the particular relationship. For Garcia, the koinonia between different perspectives is found wherever they join in debate, however unharmonious that debate might be. The individual, like the polis, unites these conflicting perspectives into a koinonia through the ongoing give and take between a plurality of internal voices. Plato's dialogues embody this sort of koinonia, and they're bringing together of the diverse voices of the characters. I find Garcia's model useful in the in its attention to the dependence of dialogue upon koinonia and vice versa, to the relation between micro and macro koinonia of soul and polis, as well as in its emphasis on the relation between the internal conflict within the audience and the external confrontation between characters in the dialogue. Where I diverge from him is in my understanding of how much commonality is required for both dialogue and koinonia. The evidence of the Crito seems to suggest that neither koinonia nor genuine shared deliberation is possible, except between those who already, in many respects, share a perspective. One of the more significant problems that this paper leaves aside is the relationship between perspective of the laws and that of the two characters. Addressing this controversy within a 30-minute paper proved beyond me. This leaves my argument pretty incomplete, since I must take as given the following by no means uncontroversial position. The laws represent a third perspective grounded in a different bedrock commitment. This perspective is incapable of dialogic koinonia with the perspectives represented by Crito and by Socrates, yet it's one with which the audience also identifies. I will say one or two things about that as I go along, and I welcome questions about it in the discussion period. This paper falls into two parts. In the first, I consider how the Crito both frames the conditions for dialogic koinonia and shows how these conditions fail to obtain in the interaction between two individuals with conflicting perspectives, that is, Crito and Socrates. In the second, I look at how the dialogue invites the audience to experience this failure of dialogic koinonia between the two characters as a failure of dialogic koinonia within their own souls. I might not reach this point, but I might end by offering a very brief suggestion of a positive role that this experience might play in the process of rational inquiry. So the Crito is rife with discussions and illustrations of different kinds of agreement and self-agreement, but perhaps the most dramatically and dialectically significant discussion of agreement in logoi is the one at 49 DDE, where dialogic koinonia is presented in terms of the sharing of a basic commitment. The dialogue not only dramatizes Socrates and Crito's failure to meet this condition, but places that failure in the context of irreconcilable perspectives understood as interrelated sets of beliefs, desires, and modes of reasoning, which both shape and are shaped by a bedrock commitment. In Socrates' case, this bedrock commitment, arguably, is to the health of the soul, that is, its freedom from defilement by unjust or wrong actions. In Crito's case, this bedrock commitment is to the attachment to duty. This bedrock commitment is the attachment and duty to family and friends. The value system here is that of kinship ethics, where justice and right action involve both duty to blood relations and the cultivation of intimate long-term friendships maintained by reciprocity and staunch loyalty. Sort of background there is the guest friendship relationship. The bedrock commitment of the laws is a bit more complex, but has as its overarching focus the unity of the polis. There's some stuff underneath that, but this division in broad strokes follows the lines established by Hart in her 1999 paper, Conflicting Values in Plato's Crito. The arguments of the Crito can be divided into three very, very broad sections. The first is Crito's attempt to convince Socrates to escape from prison prior to his impending execution. If we leave aside Socrates' failed attempt to establish dialogue at the beginning of the passage, this section is an uninterrupted monologue that runs until 46a. The third argument, which runs from 50a to 54d, is the law's response to Crito's argument, delivered by a Socrates who professes to act as an intermediary sort of for daimonic possession, daimonic inspiration. This section 2 is largely monologic. in the middle, running from 46a to 49e, we get Socrates' response to Crito's argument, delivered in his own person and through a cross-examination of Crito. Throughout this section, he hints at the issue of dialogic koinonia through his repeated exhortations to Crito. They must examine the issue in common, koine. That's something that appears in a number of dialogues, that exhortation. At 49 CE, the argument seems to reach a point of crisis, leading to a direct discussion of the conditions required in order to make such a shared investigation possible. Socrates informs Crito that dialogue is impossible between those who disagree with respect to the no retaliation principle, the position that we should never harm, and that's adikio, another, even when they have harmed us. This principle is the necessary common ground, koine boule, and shared agreement, koinonia, that must be present before genuine discussion and deliberation can happen. As Hart has shown, the no retaliation principle here expresses an even more basic commitment, the primacy of the soul's health or purity, with the latter identified or closely connected with justice. Yet Socrates has good reason for not naming this as the necessary common ground, because if he does so, he opens himself up to the misunderstandings and too quick agreements that have so far dogged his conversation with Crito. Like most 5th and 4th century Athenians, Crito would have readily agreed with the commitment to the soul's health, associating a man's state of soul with his standing among the gods and men, and probably, this is unclear how widespread, but probably his fate in the afterlife. For Socrates, the value of the soul's health or justice is not derived from other goods. Instead, the value of these goods seems to be primarily derived from its relation to justice. Living well, living nobly is living justly. 48b. By focusing instead on one of the corollaries of this commitment in the form of the no retaliation principle, Socrates forestalls further surface agreements of the kind that would obscure basic disagreement on the meaning of the same terms. He also provides the maximum level of challenge to the overly agreeable Crito, since the no retaliation principle conflicts directly with Crito's kinship ethics, according to which justice is rooted in reciprocity. This is the Simonides' formula, harming one's enemies and helping one's friends. And I just had a brain fart. I'm not absolutely certain that's Simonides now. Sorry. Crito and Socrates' disagreement on the no retaliation principle can be traced not only to their unvoiced disagreement on the nature of justice, but also to their divergent views on the appropriate modes of reasoning. Socrates declares that his primary allegiance is to conclusions arrived at through consistent, rationally structured arguments. Logistomai, I'm sorry, that remain unshaken regardless of the circumstances in which he finds himself. He honors tamao and gives pride of place, prespeeo, to those arguments that seem to him best. Here, his wording suggests the difference between his values and Crito's. In using two words that belong more naturally to relations of kin and community, the correct disposition towards one's parents, elders, or guests, friends, he implicitly identifies the source of division between Crito's approach to the arguments and his own. For Crito, it is his affections and duties to others that receive his primary allegiance, so the value he assigns to consistent, rationally structured argument changes in relation to the practical urgency and significance of the given question and his relationship to the interlocutor. as is clear when we compare his relative enthusiasm for and attentiveness to such arguments in this dialogue as contrasted with the Euthydemus. Crito's mode of thought is nailed to the specific, the personal, the relationally contingent. He frames his argument in terms of deeds, outlining in precise detail the pragmatic issues associated with escape, carefully accounting for the various practical objections and contingencies. Yet when it comes to the more general principles through which Socrates proposes to address the question of justice or injustice, the justice or injustice of escape, Crito becomes cavalier about the disagreement or disagreement of his own logoi. That is, he cannot seem to credit the importance of consistency, regardless of personal relations, upon which structured rational argument and Socratic justice depends. Socrates' focus on general rational principles, on the other hand, cannot unpack the kind of personal, context-specific associated linkages through which Crito runs together issues of justice, money, reputation, and family. His argument for the injustice of escape simply begins by dismissing the latter three considerations out of hand. Thus, both Crito's and Socrates' mode of thinking and listening are bound up with their bedrock commitment and their effective orientation, or effective orientations, modes of thought and reasoning, and judgments that are both arise from and reinforce those commitments. This means that they have a tendency to miss a point in their responses to one another's arguments, not necessarily through a misunderstanding of the main claims and inferences, but through a failure to engage with what matters most in the argument, its motivating core. For instance, Socrates' first argument, while framed as a response to Crito, actually fails to engage with one point to which Crito returns over and over, both directly and indirectly, that Socrates' death will be for him the loss of a great friend. As commentators often complain, the emotional pressure that informs the structure of Crito's argument, preempting a more logical arrangement. As commentators often complain, there's an emotional structure that informs there's emotional pressure that informs the structure of Crito's argument, preempting a more logical arrangement for an immediate communication of urgency and grief. Yet if Crito's argument is inferentially shaky, what he offers is not mere persuasion of the kind in which orators engage. His speech is full of personal proofs of devotion and demands for reciprocal regard, which are very specific, very, very specific to the person he's speaking to, not just the audience, but all of which draw attention to a different notion of consistency and a different primary allegiance than the Socratic allegiance, the rationally structured argument. This personal element, including Crito's sense of loss, is something that Socrates tactfully brackets. His argument begins by returning to the issue that they were discussing prior to Crito's long, breathless monologue, whether we should take notice of the views of the majority in our deliberation. At 49 CDE, the gap between the two characters comes out into the open, or almost, as the no retaliation principle emerges from Socrates' argument. Crito, without ever disagreeing, begins to qualify his responses, adding, it seems, finitai, or I suppose, depu. Socrates takes this hesitancy as a sign for him to repeat his exhortations to Crito to engage fully in the argument, since Socrates immediately adds that no meaningful discussion. Socrates takes this hesitancy as a sign for him to repeat his exhortations to Crito to engage fully in the argument, and if he disagrees, to say so and argue for his position. But this exhortation is actually a catch-22, since Socrates immediately adds that no meaningful discussion can take place between those who disagree with respect to this principle. The apparent effect of this conflict is to reduce Crito to near silence. Socrates' attempt to continue their line of argument comes to an end a few lines on, when Socrates draws out an apparent practical consequence from the no retaliation principle. He cannot escape from prison, since it would involve doing harm by violating a just agreement. Crito can neither assent to nor deny this statement. He seems unable to process it at all. He says, instead, I can't answer your question, Socrates. I don't understand. We get an echo of this exchange at 54D, at the dialogue's end. Socrates has just finished his speech on behalf of the laws. He says he is deafened by what he seems to hear the laws say, and that if Crito argues against them, he will do so to no purpose. He then urges Crito to speak if he thinks that speech will accomplish anything. Within the dramatic context, this looks like Crito's last chance to change Socrates' mind, and Crito responds with his final line of the dialogue. Not the final line of the dialogue, but Crito's final line. I have nothing to say. I don't mean to elide here the significant differences between communicative and argumentative context of 49D to E and 54D. What the two passages share in common, however, is the way in which they crystallize the situation that Crito and Socrates have found themselves in throughout the dialogue. Both are motivated by commitments that make communication a matter of urgency, so that they recognize whether communication has happened or not, and keep trying to do it, to undertake it. In Socrates' case, this is the commitment to dialogue and the care of Crito's soul. In Crito's case, this is his commitment to interpersonal ties, and his belief that certain outcomes are that he needs to protect Socrates from himself, since he believes that Socrates has bungled a lot of things. Yet the pressure to speak is accompanied by a growing awareness of its futility. Both are in some ways deaf with respect to one another's arguments and dumb with respect to their own. The Crito then offers an account of basic conditions for dialogic koinonia between two people. They must share a common ground in the form of fundamental commitment. It also shows why such a shared commitment is necessary to meaningful dialogue, since the former is bound up with a whole network of interrelated beliefs, desires, and values that also imply different modes of thought and reasoning. I'd like to suggest, probably very briefly, that the conditions of dialogic koinonia that obtain between souls also obtain within souls. In other words, a soul that possesses two conflicting basic commitments or values lacks of common ground that would allow it to engage in meaningful dialogue with itself. There is a sense in which it cannot think if we take thought to involve, as in the Theaetetus, the capacity to affirm or deny a series of statements in a process that produces a belief, that is, a statement that the soul consistently affirms or denies. The breakdown of communication between Crito and Socrates would, I think, be mirrored by the internal experience of the dialogue's audience, whose identification with the two characters' conflicting perspectives would lead to an experience of recognition of internal incoherence that has undermined the effort to judge the argument, that undermines the effort to judge the arguments and claims expressed by the characters. So that they're confronted with an experience of self-disagreement. They cannot affirm or deny things consistently, not merely because their beliefs are in conflict, but because their very modes of reasoning and judging are at odds. Just to start with, there are good reason to think that, as Hart has shown, that both of the bedrock commitments associated with Socrates and Crito's clashing perspectives or values that the audience would recognize as their own, and I'm gonna take that as given. So beyond the, because I'm running out of time. So beyond that, beyond the recognition of the intellectual recognition of these shared commitments, there's an emotional identification with the two characters whose clashing perspectives are grounded in those two clashing basic commitments. This serves to more fully implicate the audience, impressing upon them an experience of internal conflict that threatens to undermine the conditions of reasoned analysis. Consider the dialogue's opening. Crito has been watching a sleeping Socrates for a long time. Despite the sense of urgency that brings him to his friend's cell so early, Crito does not wake his friend. He is reluctant to disturb Socrates' peaceful rest, given the distressing reality that awaits him when he wakes. The tenderness and grief that imbue this image constitutes an immediate invitation to the audience to share in Crito's perspective. At the same time, the dream that Socrates describes, in which a noble woman dressed in white comes to him saying, "In 3 days you might reach Thea," invites us to share in Socrates' perspective. It feels like there's longing here, which is made all the more acute by the fact that Plato has retained the optative and the ken, a subtle reminder that Achilles' own dream of homecoming went unfulfilled. Though this may simply be a way of signaling that Socrates' longing is a negative one, a longing to be freed, arguably, of all the ties of embodiment, so that the uncertainty surrounding the arrival in some afterlife is peripheral. Such a longing might not be easy for the audience to embrace on its own terms. Yet when superimposed upon a negative narrative moment rife with cultural associations and significance, it becomes possible for them to share in his perspective and his desire even here. The interpretation of the dream, moreover, offers a particularly vivid instance of the kind of perspective-based conflict the dialogue invites from the audience. Socrates says the meaning of the dream is clear. Crito disagrees, that agrees, but Crito agrees with everything when challenged, unless it's core. But both the wording and the allusion combine to make the noblewoman's pronouncement a highly ambiguous one. The open-endedness of the potential optative multiplies the possible implication of the dream. So an audience moved by Crito's commitment to Socrates and is pleased that the latter not abandon his friends would find themselves more inclined to judge the meaning of the dream in line with the kinship commitment. So Achilles didn't return home. He had this duty of reciprocity. But if the audience identifies with Socrates and the no retaliation principle, then Achilles would have kept his soul safe if he had returned to Thea, because he would have removed himself from the cycle of retaliation. And I'm going to stop there. And I wanted to say, just I have had a lot of help from my peers. Professor Gonzalez helped me with read my abstract. I did not mean to pin any of this on him. I will pin this on my peers, though. It's there.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, you can pin it on me. It's okay. But you give us much to talk about. So I'll open just the floor to discussion. We have 10 minutes. So does anyone want to go first? I can start us off if no one wants to go first, but okay, I'll start us off. Just two quick questions, sort of obvious questions, but I would like to hear more what you'd have to say in response. One is simply whether you're so convinced as you appear to be that Socrates and Crito do not find common ground, that their communication is a failure, as you put it. I mean, you gave some kind of evidence to Finati that it seems that having nothing to say, Crito having nothing to say at the end of the dialogue. But is that sufficient evidence to suggest that they haven't achieved common ground? I mean, in the case of the Gorgias, it's obvious that the dialogue breaks down between Socrates and Callicles. It's not so obvious. That's not so obvious to me in the case of Socrates and Crito. I mean, it could be that Crito is convinced. He says it seems so, and he has nothing to object at the end because he's persuaded. And
right.
I guess that raises a bigger question of how do we determine? I don't know what the answer to this question is. How do we determine in a Platonic dialogue whether the dialogue has been successful or not? That's always a very tricky thing. So that's
I think there's another form of Lenkos that I think takes place, and I think that Crito ends up dealing with conflicting duties that lead him to be willing to go with the God. That like, I mean, I think that's what he thinks he's doing. So I mean, and the conflicting duties are, on one hand, he has this duty to save Socrates. Socrates is a fuck up. I mean, like he can't get, he doesn't have any money. Crito is one of the wealthiest citizens. He bungled his, this is obviously Crito's perspective. He bungled his defense. This is what, so I mean, I think there is some evidence from the dialogues that Crito's already doing managing stuff for Socrates behind the scenes, especially in the Phaedo, so his family life, his so I think that he's got this duty to save Socrates, and then he's got this other duty, which I think comes in the speech of the laws, I think wakes something else up, which doesn't have to do with the laws. I think it is the fact that they very strongly echo the tone of the Erinyes. And I think that Crito is realizing that there is that he might be bringing something worse down on Socrates' head. So he's stuck between these things, and I think that that's how he gets to common ground with Socrates. So it isn't. There's nothing. I think this is happening on a level of emotional response more than a level of. I think it's thumotic. I think that everything that happens with Crito is thumotic. He isn't really that strongly mediated through argument. His thought isn't that strongly mediated through rational argument.
Okay. Anyone else want to jump in here? Okay, well, I did have a second one. I was going to jump in very quickly. And this I think is a part of your paper you maybe didn't get to. But my question simply is, do you think Socrates finds common ground with himself at the end of the dialogue? Because you made a suggestion that there are three interlocutors here in a way: Socrates, Crito, and the laws, right? And you made the suggestion, if I understood correctly towards the beginning, that the laws also don't share the perspective of Socrates. And so you have this Socrates at the end of the dialogue who is speaking on behalf of the laws and saying, as you quoted that passage, that the laws are deaf, and what the laws are saying, is buzzing in his ears, and he can't think of a response. Yeah. So is this a Socrates in conflict with himself?
Yes.
That the Micro-Koinōniai you talked about, that his own Micro-Koinōniai is sort of he has the voice of the laws that he finds persuasive, but he too can't quite accept. So doesn't have an answer to that.
Yeah. So this is slightly different because I have stolen wholesale Mitchell Miller's view on this, but this is slightly different because it's deliberate. But he has to alienate himself from his own perspective. He cannot think as himself when he's thinking as the laws. He has to alienate himself from his way of thinking. He has to alienate himself from his values that say this is how it works. This is how the argument proceeds. This is not how he wants things. This is not the kind of thing that he wants to be giving Crito, but it's what he can give him. And so there's a sort of like there's a necessary disjoint that he has to make in order to do this.
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess with that we can move on if there are no other questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Y con esos cambios de idioma y de continente, para la conferencia de Lucas Soares con el título Psicologización. Me pasé la mañana practicando decir eso. Psicologización. No, ahora lo hice una vez. Psicologización de la política y crítica psicológica de la poesía en República 4 y 10. Lucas.
Well, thanks, Francisco. It's a pleasure for me to share this meeting with so many colleagues. My paper is the only one in Spanish, so I start. Sobre el trasfondo de un modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto, la meta psicopolítica de Platón en la República apunta a lograr el gobierno de sí mismo en relación con las tres partes del alma, logisticón, Charmides y epimeticón. Alcanzar la unidad psíquica como condición de posibilidad de la unidad política, puesto que el objetivo de la política no es otro para Platón que el mejoramiento de los individuos, lo cual solo puede lograrse por medio de un perfeccionamiento del alma. Recordemos al respecto aquel pasaje clave del Gorgias, 464b4. Yo llamo política a la técnica que tiene al alma por objeto. Fin de la cita. En este sentido, la posibilidad de la justicia psíquica y política va a depender del grado de resolución del conflicto entre los tres géneros que componen el alma individual y la polis. Por otra parte, en el libro 10 de la República, tras las críticas de orden ontológico y epistemológico a la tradición poética griega, Platón se ocupa de los efectos psicológicos de la poesía mimético-placentera en sus receptores. Como en las argumentaciones precedentes, parte aquí de un supuesto: la naturaleza compuesta del alma. Si bien el tema de los tres impulsos fundamentales que caracterizan la actividad psíquica ya había sido desarrollado en el libro 4, a Platón le interesa en el libro 10 detenerse sobre todo en la contraposición entre la mejor y la peor parte del alma, logisticón y alogiston. Una de las cuestiones centrales de este libro apunta, en efecto, a analizar cuál es la parte del alma sobre la que el imitador, o sea, el mimetés, ejerce su poder. Tras examinar, en primer lugar, la psicologización de la política a la luz de una serie de pasajes en los que cabe leer la prioridad de la tripartición psíquica por sobre la de orden político, y, en segundo lugar, puntualizar algunos de los rasgos centrales de la crítica psicológica a la poesía mimético-placentera, en este trabajo me interesa sostener que en la República la posibilidad de una buena koinonia, unidad, alianza, comunidad, en términos psíquicos y políticos, se halla obstaculizada, entre otras causas, por la perversión psicológica que dicha poesía ejerce sobre sus receptores. Primera parte, psicopolítica en República 4. En República 4, 486 a 8 C2, Platón introduce por vez primera la problemática postulación de la tripartición de las partes funciones del alma. Arriba a ella partiendo del supuesto de que en la realidad psicológica del individuo existe una estasis, sedición, revuelta, lucha de facciones, etc., entre partes, especies o géneros naturalmente unidos. Una turbación producida a causa de la injusticia, contrapuesta a la concordia y amistad originada en el alma como resultado de la justicia. El modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto implica así, en principio, la aceptación de que, cito, nuestra alma está llena de miles de contradicciones de esa clase que surgen al mismo tiempo. República 10, 603 D6. Facciones contrarias que desatan en su interior una guerra civil o lucha consigo misma. A través de esta lucha psíquica de facciones, Platón procura resaltar la constitución política del alma humana, a la vez que dar cuenta de la importancia que detenta el modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto para pensar lo relativo a la polis. Porque para él no se trata solo de prestar atención a la guerra interior de una gente que lucha psíquicamente consigo mismo. Importa sobre todo atender a la proyección de tal estasis en el plano político o comunal. Partiendo de este supuesto fundamental del estasis del alma y más concretamente de la mala organización política que la distingue interiormente, quisiera destacar solo 3 aspectos del modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto a través de los cuales creo puede advertirse la prioridad que detenta dicho supuesto como hecho determinante no solo para la reflexión platónica acerca de la política, sino también, tal como veremos en la segunda sección, como un aspecto decisivo a la hora de determinar la exclusión de la poesía mimética tradicional de la polis proyectada. El primer aspecto de la psicología de partes en conflicto que me interesa destacar se vincula con el denominado método psicopolítico, cuya inclusión es para Platón funcional de cara al objetivo principal que persigue en la República, a saber, la investigación acerca de la naturaleza de la justicia y de la felicidad que ésta representa para el justo. Como es sabido, mediante este principio metodológico, Platón procura dar cuenta de la homoiosis o paralelismo estructural que existe entre la justicia en los planos individual y político. Bajo un enfoque de tipo organicista, Platón prioriza metodológicamente el examen de la naturaleza de la justicia en la polis, o sea, justicia política, por sobre el de la naturaleza de la justicia en el individuo, justicia psíquica, pues de esta forma la justicia se dejará ver teóricamente en caracteres más grandes y por tanto más fáciles de discernir que en la escala menor del individuo. Como resumirá más tarde en Leyes 10.902c, cito, es más difícil ver y oír lo pequeño que lo grande. Fin de la cita. Si bien a lo que quiere arribar en última instancia es a la naturaleza de la justicia en el alma, la justicia del alma, en términos de visión es peor la que podamos llegar a tener de esta, a causa de su naturaleza invisible, que la que ofrece la polis, cuya naturaleza, además de visible, se caracteriza, como señala Belletti, por diferencias de tipo dimensional cuantitativo. Así como en el tránsito analógico estructural que va de la escala macropolítica a la micropolítica del alma, se irán precisando mejor las diferencias y semejanzas entre los planos político y psíquico de la justicia. En tanto engrandecimiento del alma individual, la polis platónica vendría a ser la pintura más perfecta de aquella justicia necesaria para que cada uno de los individuos alcance su perfección en el plano político. Si, independientemente de su valor pedagógico persuasivo, entendemos que la analogía polis-alma se halla subordinada al argumento que sostiene la tripartición postulada en el libro 4, la posibilidad de la justicia psíquica y política va a depender del grado de resolución de la estasis entre los 3 géneros de naturaleza, trita, gene, fisión, que componen el alma individual y la polis. O en otras palabras, del grado de resolución que se derive de la estasis en lo privado y en lo público. Cito un pasaje de República 5.470b. Cito, creo que a los 2 nombres de guerra y sedición corresponden 2 realidades en las discordias que se dan en 2 terrenos distintos. Lo uno se da en lo doméstico y allegado, lo otro en lo ajeno y extraño. La enemistad en lo doméstico es llamada sedición, en lo ajeno, guerra. Fin de la cita. Tal grado de resolución dependerá a su vez del cumplimiento del otro principio sobre el que, en correspondencia con las diferencias por naturaleza, descansa todo el edificio conceptual de la polis proyectada, a saber, el principio de la especialización de las funciones. Según este principio, cada parte o estamento de la polis, al igual que cada parte del alma, debe atender exclusivamente al cumplimiento de una función específica. De la violación de este principio en el plano del alma y de la polis se deriva la injusticia psíquica y política a la manera de una, cito, turbación y extravío de las 3 especies del alma. Cito un pasaje de República 4.44b. Entonces, ¿es necesario que dadas estas 3 partes, la injusticia sea a su vez un conflicto, interferencia, cambio de papeles e insurrección de una parte contra el conjunto del alma para gobernar ella, aunque no le corresponda, sino que por ser naturalmente así le convenga estar subordinada a la que en realidad es la parte rectora? Fin de la cita. De allí que, tal como leemos en el libro 9, en el marco de la tercera prueba de la superioridad del justo sobre el injusto, la definición misma de la justicia política encuentre su base de apoyo en la justicia psíquica. Cito un pasaje de República 9, 586e. Por tanto, cuando toda el alma sigue a la parte filosófica y no entra en conflicto, entonces sucede que cada una de sus partes hace lo que le es propio y que es justo. Fin de la cita. El segundo aspecto a destacar del modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto lo hallamos en el contexto de la presentación de las 4 virtudes cardinales en República 4, 427d a 436a, y más puntualmente las definiciones de la sofrosine y de la dikaiosine. Respecto de la sofrosine, Platón señala que su principal función consiste en obedecer a los que gobiernan y gobernar uno mismo los placeres relativos a las bebidas, comidas y amorosos. El énfasis psicológico de la definición de la sofrosine aparece en el libro 4, cuando se la define como un cierto orden y autodominio frente a ciertos placeres y deseos. República 4, 430e. Esta virtud se vincula así, desde el punto de vista psicológico, con la idea de autodominio, de Encrátera, en cuanto a placeres y deseos, y en sentido político con la idea de subordinación a la autoridad. Más puntualmente, el ser dueño de sí mismos, to Crito autou, que define a la sofrosine, se expresa en términos psicológicos cuando lo que es mejor, o sea, lo racional, domina por intermedio de su alianza con la parte fogosa a lo que es peor, lo apetitivo, dominación psíquica para la cual es fundamental la contribución de una buena paideia como instancia mediadora en la estasis entre las 3 partes del alma. En este respecto, como veremos más adelante, será prioritario para Platón el examen del rol negativo que, en términos psicopolíticos, ejerce la poesía mimética tradicional sobre las almas de sus receptores. Por el contrario, cuando lo peor logra imponerse sobre lo que es mejor, el individuo se vuelve esclavo de sí, es decir, un intemperante, acólastos. Correlativamente, en términos políticos, el dominio de sí se traduce en una armonización entre lo que es inferior, gobernados, y lo que es superior, gobernantes, por naturaleza, respecto de cuál de los dos debe gobernar en la polis. La dimensión política de la sofrosine comporta la idea de una igualdad de opiniones u opinión compartida entre los gobernantes y los gobernados, tal como se dice en República 4, 433c. De modo tal que solo cuando una polis es realmente dueña de sí misma en lo que concierne a sus placeres y deseos, puede decirse que cuenta con unidad política. Para Platón es por tanto evidente que la pérdida del gobierno de sí en el alma individual, y por extensión en la polis, acontece cuando se desata una estasis en su interior. República 8, 545c, d, 554d. En cuanto a la virtud de la justicia, su definición canónica como el hacer cada uno lo suyo, supone que los 3 géneros de la polis, perfectos guardianes, guardianes auxiliares y productores, deben hallar su correlato en el plano del alma individual, en cuyo interior se reproducen esos 3 mismos géneros. De allí que el dejar de hacer cada uno lo suyo, o sea, el intercambio y la variación de ocupaciones por parte de un mismo individuo o estamento, constituya la injusticia en el alma y en la polis. El pasaje clave que, a mi entender, revela la prioridad que la justicia de orden psíquico detenta por sobre la de orden político puede leerse en el libro 4, cuando Platón señala que la justicia de la polis es una, cito, cierta imagen de la justicia. Eidolon, tites, dikaiosines, República 4, 443c4. Si tal justicia política tiene para él estatus de eidolon, de imagen, cabe tomar a la justicia de orden psíquico como paradigma de aquella, como modelo. Como bien señala Cantosperber, la justicia política platónica, cito, no se refiere tanto al respeto de los derechos como a la contribución que cada individuo, cuando cumple la tarea que le corresponde y se conforma con su parte y su lugar, aporta al orden de la ciudad. Fin de la cita. En este sentido, la estasis interior del alma no solo constituiría la base para definir en clave política las virtudes de la sofrosine y la dikaiosine, sino que también sería la que, proyectada al orden de la polis, terminaría por revelarse como el paradigma para pensar la política. El tercer y último aspecto del modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto que quiero destacar se da casi en el marco inmediato de la postulación de la tripartición psíquica en República 4, 435b, 436a. Sobre el trasfondo de la semejanza estructural individuo-polis postulada en el libro 2, Platón opera allí la traslación al plano del alma individual de los resultados alcanzados en torno a la justicia en la polis proyectada, cuya organización puede calificarse como justa, en tanto los 3 géneros de naturalezas que hay en ella realicen cada una lo suyo propio. Traducida esta articulación tripartita a la realidad psicológica del individuo, se trata de examinar la cuestión central de si el alma, encarnada y no separada del cuerpo, como en el caso del libro 10, tiene en sí misma esas tres especies o no. República 4, 435c. Aquí leemos un pasaje clave que supone la idea de que el carácter, o sea, el etos de una determinada ciudad, se deriva del carácter de los ciudadanos que la componen. Cito un pasaje de República 4, 435e. ¿No nos será acaso absolutamente necesario reconocer que en cada uno de nosotros se dan las mismas especies y caracteres que en la ciudad? Pues no llegan allí de otro lado. Fin de la cita. De allí que Platón señale a continuación que la naturaleza fogosa de ciudades tales como Tracia, Escitia y las situadas en la región norteña se expliquen a partir del carácter fogoso de sus individuos, que el deseo de aprender que impera en ciudades como Atenas se deduzca de la naturaleza racional de sus individuos, y que la afición al comercio que caracteriza a los fenicios se derive del carácter apetitivo de sus individuos. En conformidad con este pasaje, en el libro 8 leemos otro que viene a reforzar la tesis de que los regímenes políticos se derivan del modo de ser de los individuos de las ciudades. Cito, República 8, 544d. ¿Entiendes entonces, dije yo, que es necesario que existan tantas especies de caracteres humanos como de regímenes políticos? ¿O crees que las organizaciones políticas nacen de una encina o una roca y no de los caracteres de los individuos en las ciudades? Fin de la cita. Los tres aspectos del modelo psicológico de partes en conflicto revelados hasta aquí nos enfrentan a una de las cuestiones centrales del libro 4, a saber, ¿en qué tipo de tripartición psíquica o política cabe colocar la prioridad? Aquí es donde, por supuesto, entran a jugar las divergencias interpretativas, puesto que en la República pueden hallarse pasajes que abonan una u otra posición. Aun cuando a primera vista todo indique que la tripartición psíquica se deriva de la tripartición política, tal como puede observarse en República 4, 440e, 441c, libro 9, 580d, etc., cabe pensar a partir de los aspectos mencionados que la tripartición política se deduce más bien de la tripartición psíquica, tal como puede verse en República 4, 431ab y c9d2. Tendríamos en este sentido un doble movimiento metodológico argumentativo de tipo circular, que supone, por un lado, un punto de partida en la escala macropolítica de los libros 2 y 3, con el fin de arribar a la organización micropolítica del alma del libro 4. Por otro lado, partiendo de esta última, Platón procuraría dar cuenta de la estructura de la polis desde una matriz psicológica, cuya función apunta a cerrar el círculo al erigirse en el libro 4 y en parte del 9 como la verdadera base de sustentación de la organización política. Dicho de otra manera, del reconocimiento y análisis previos del estasis interior del alma, desembocamos en una psicologización de la política. Platón se encarga así en República 4 de introducir la idea de que es la estasis interior del alma la que estaría dando cuenta de su réplica en el plano político, o lo que es lo mismo, que la polis no sería sino el reflejo exterior de la estasis que anida en el individuo, y la erradicación de tal estasis interior, la meta psicopolítica del diálogo. A fin de cuentas, la consideración de la ciudad, es decir, del aspecto político, estuvo desde el inicio subordinada al objetivo ético de la consideración del individuo. República 2, 368c a 369a10. Con ello no pretendo en absoluto reducir toda la propuesta política de la República a una psicología moral individual, sino más bien resaltar el peso que dentro de la arquitectura conceptual del diálogo detenta la psicología en función de la reflexión política y de la recusación de la poesía tradicional. Si a la luz de lo relevado hasta aquí aceptamos que en República 4 lo que más le importa a Platón en términos psicopolíticos es la erradicación del estasis interior del alma, podrá entenderse mejor su necesidad de reevaluar en clave psicológica a la poesía mimética tradicional en el libro 10, ya que esta poesía promueve en las almas de sus receptores una sublevación que obtura toda posibilidad de una buena koinonia política. Segunda parte, crítica psicopoética en República 10. Una vez desarrollada en el libro 10 la dimensión ontológica y epistemológica de la crítica a la poesía tradicional, Platón reformula dicha crítica en función de los efectos psicológicos que acarrea la recepción de la poesía mimético-placentera. Esto en República 10, 602c a 608b. Señalaba al comienzo que, a diferencia del enfoque psicológico tripartito del libro cuarto, en el contexto de su discusión con los poetas tradicionales del libro 10, a Platón le interesa abordar la estasis del alma en los términos de un conflicto entre dos elementos psíquicos básicos, racional e irracional, subsumiendo en este último las partes fogosa y apetitiva, tal como aparecen en República 10, 602c a 605c y 606d. Y sobre todo, indagar en torno a la parte del alma en la que más influye la dinamis del mimetés, ya sea este poeta o pintor. De los múltiples aspectos que se desprenden de esta crítica psicopoética, aquí solo me interesa subrayar dos puntos en función de lo examinado en la sección anterior. El primer punto se vincula con la incorporación de un nuevo motivo, además de los de índole religiosa y ético-política y ontológica y epistemológica, ya examinados en los libros 2, 3 y parte del 10, para condenar y excluir al poeta mimético tradicional de la polis ideal, pues este no se ajusta a la estimulación y fortalecimiento de la parte racional del alma, cuyos atributos esenciales son el medir, el contar y el pesar, sino antes bien al trato exclusivo con el elemento irracional, como dice en República 10, 604d9. Parte responsable, parte irracional, responsable del amplio abanico de perturbaciones sensoriales, desiderativas, emocionales e intelectuales que aquejan y debilitan al alma. Apoyado en un enfoque psicológico bipartito, Platón reitera en este libro 10 su parecer fundamental acerca de la superioridad del elemento racional por sobre el irracional, afirmando que lo que se apoya en la medida y el cálculo representa no solo lo mejor de nuestra alma, sino el fármacon, o sea, el antídoto más apropiado para contrarrestar los efectos psicológicos nocivos de la poesía mimético-placentera. De aquí que todo lo que se oponga a tal fármacon sea visto como una manifestación de vileza, y que en última instancia tal vileza, falsedad y enfermedad tengan para él su origen en la tecne mimetique. Cito un pasaje de República 10, 603a. A esta confesión quería yo llegar cuando dije que la pintura y en general todo arte imitativo hace sus trabajos a gran distancia de la verdad y que trata y tiene amistad con aquella parte de nosotros que se aparta de la razón y ello sin ningún fin sano ni verdadero. Y así, cosa vil y vinculada a cosa vil, solo lo vil es engendrado por el arte imitativo. Fin de la cita. El tipo de distorsión psíquica que engendra la poesía mimético-placentera en sus receptores es comparable al encantamiento, goetelia, que ejercen la pintura sombreada, la prestidigitación o los diversos recursos a los que apela la magia, tal como se dice en República 7 y 10. Pues tanto estos como aquella tienen trato exclusivo con el elemento más deleznable que reside en nuestra alma. Pero ¿cuáles son, más concretamente hablando, los efectos psicológicos que suscita esta poesía mimética tradicional al entrar en contacto con el elemento irracional del alma? Al poner en escena las innumerables contradicciones que se originan en el alma individual, esta poesía no contribuye a su resolución mediante la medida y el cálculo, sino al contrario, a su potenciación. En lugar de infundir unidad psíquica, la poesía mimética tradicional profundiza las divisiones y alteraciones del alma, engendrando en sus receptores una disensión interior en lo que respecta a sus placeres y dolores, deseos, emociones y pensamientos. Cito un pasaje de República 10, 603c. ¿Y acaso el hombre se mantiene en todos ellos, en todos los actos imitados, ¿no?, en un mismo pensamiento? ¿O se dividirá también en sus actos y se pondrá en lucha consigo mismo a la manera que se dividía en la visión y tenía en sí al mismo tiempo opiniones contrarias sobre los mismos objetos? Fin de la cita. El segundo punto de la crítica psicológica que me interesa destacar se relaciona con el tipo de poesía que Platón, en contraste con la poesía tradicional, admitiría en su polis ideal. Supeditada al logos y al nomos, tal como dice República 10.603c, 604b, esta poesía admisible promovería en sus receptores una clara unidad y autodominio psíquicos como resultado de su trato exclusivo con la parte racional del alma. Cito un pasaje de República 10, 604a, 10 y 605d. Ahora bien, lo que le manda a resistir no es la razón y la ley, y lo que le arrastra a los dolores no es su mismo pesar. Habiendo pues dos impulsos en el hombre sobre el mismo objeto y al mismo tiempo, por fuerza decimos ha de haber en él dos elementos distintos. Pero cuando a nosotros mismos nos ocurre una desgracia, ya sabes que presumimos de lo contrario, si podemos quedar tranquilos y dominarnos, pensando que esto es propio de varón y aquello otro que antes celebrábamos de mujer. Fin de la cita. Los destinatarios de esta poesía admisible estarían así en mejores condiciones para oponer una más firme resistencia a las contradicciones y alteraciones suscitadas por la parte irracional y para aprender a moderar los aspectos vinculados al deseo y la ira. Si el elemento racional del alma se dejara regir por la ley y consecuentemente el irracional se subordinara a él, alcanzaríamos así un importante equilibrio psicológico a cuya meta debe aspirar, para Platón, toda poesía que se precie como buena, provechosa y verdadera en el más alto grado. Cito un pasaje de República 10.604b. La ley dice que es conveniente guardar lo más posible la tranquilidad en los azares y no afligirse, ya que no está claro lo que hay de bueno o de malo en tales cosas, que tampoco adelanta nada el que las lleva mal, que nada humano hay digno de gran afán, y que lo que en tales situaciones debe venir más prontamente en nuestra ayuda quede impedido por el mismo dolor. Fin de la cita. La razón que voluntariamente sigue y obedece a la ley logra resolver las divisiones y contradicciones del alma causadas por las desgracias y lamentaciones. Logra, en una palabra, contener al elemento irracional en su conjunto. La parte racional procede de este modo mediante un tipo de inferencia fundamental, según la cual debemos acostumbrar al alma a tornarse lo antes posible a su curación y al enderezamiento de lo caído y enfermo, suprimiendo sus lamentos a través de ese fármaco ligado al logos y al nomos. Al hacer confluir su crítica psicológica al poeta mimético tradicional con la cuestión de la distancia de orden epistémico que éste mantiene respecto de la verdad, Platón alcanza una síntesis que, desde ambas perspectivas, psicológica y epistémica, aporta una razón de peso para determinar la no admisión de la poesía mimética tradicional en su polis ideal. Cito un pasaje de República 10.605a-c. Con razón, pues, la emprendemos con él y lo colocamos en correspondencia con el pintor, porque de una parte se le parecen componer cosas perversas en relación con la verdad, y de otra se le iguala en su relación íntima con uno de los elementos del alma y no con el mejor. Y así fue justo no recibirle en una ciudad que debía ser regida por buenas leyes, puesto que aviva y nutre ese elemento del alma y haciéndolo fuerte acaba con la razón, a la manera que alguien dando poder en una ciudad a unos miserables traiciona esta y pierde a los ciudadanos más prudentes. De este modo, diremos, el poeta imitativo implanta un régimen perverso en la propia alma de cada uno, condescendiendo con el elemento irracional que hay en ella, elemento que no distingue lo grande de lo pequeño, sino que considera las mismas cosas unas veces como grandes, otras como pequeñas, creando imágenes enteramente apartadas de la verdad. Fin de la cita. La estrategia argumentativa contra la poesía mimético tradicional seguida por Platón en este tramo del libro 10 nos permite así inferir, por contraste, los requisitos que caracterizarían a su nuevo paradigma poético, sustituto de aquella. La principal diferencia entre ambos paradigmas poéticos estribaría en el elemento del alma al que se dirige cada uno de ellos. El paradigma mimético tradicional, incluyendo dentro de él a todos sus géneros, tiene como objeto de imitación privilegiado las diversas clases de caracteres irracionales, puesto que son las más fáciles de imitar y las que más satisfacen el gusto de la multitud reunida en una asamblea, una fiesta o el teatro, tal como se dice en República 10.605 CD. Contrariamente, el paradigma poético alternativo de Platón se propone como meta la imitación exclusiva de caracteres racionales y moderados, Cito un pasaje de República 10, 604e a 605a. Ahora bien, uno de esos elementos, el irritable, admite mucha y variada imitación, pero el carácter reflexivo y tranquilo, siendo siempre semejante a sí mismo, no es fácil de imitar ni cómodo de comprender cuando es imitado. Es manifiesto, por tanto, que el poeta imitativo no está destinado por naturaleza a ese elemento del alma, ni su ciencia se hizo para agradarle si ha de ganar renombre entre la multitud, sino para el carácter irritable y multiforme, porque es fácil de imitar. Fin de la cita. Si los poetas tradicionales continúan ajustándose a la mímesis de caracteres irritables y multiformes, por ejemplo, los relativos al timós y a los deseos irracionales del alma, si siguen persiguiendo a toda costa solo lo placentero, seductor o agradable, sus receptores seguirán implantando en sus almas un etos conforme al imitado, debido justamente a la falta de carácter acrítico que Platón supone en dichas almas frente a la mímesis poética. Pero si contrariamente a ello diéramos con un poeta que, en lugar de tener contacto estrecho con la parte irracional, apuntara exclusivamente a la mímesis de caracteres reflexivos y tranquilos, habríamos encontrado un tipo de poesía que nos volvería mejores y más dichosos en términos psicopolíticos. Cito un pasaje de República 10, 607a. Pero has de saber igualmente que en lo relativo a poesía no han de admitirse en la ciudad más que los himnos a los dioses y los encomios de los héroes. Y si admites también la musa placentera en cantos o en poemas, reinarán en tu ciudad el placer y el dolor, en vez de la ley y de aquel razonamiento que en cada caso parezca mejor a la comunidad. Fin de la cita. Termino. Llegados hasta aquí, podemos concluir que de la estrecha vinculación establecida por Platón entre la poesía mimética tradicional y la pareja placer-dolor, se desprende como resultado la turbación y extravío de las tres especies del alma individual y de las tres partes de la polis. O sea, disensión y enfermedad psicológica y política. Todo lo contrario a la primacía y gobierno de la verdad, la ley y la razón, a los que él aspira en su polis ideal. A la luz de la psicologización de la política que examinamos en el libro cuarto, la perversión, o sea, la ponería psicológica ejercida por la poesía mimética tradicional sobre sus receptores, al estimular y fortalecer la peor alianza entre las partes apetitiva y fogosa en detrimento de la parte racional, termina por revelarse como uno de los principales obstáculos para la consecución de una buena politeia interior y exterior, tal como se dice en República 9, 591e, 592a, etc. Pues al encender un estasis interior en el alma, la poesía mimética tradicional contribuye a la pérdida del gobierno de sí en términos individuales y, por extensión, políticos. Como resumirá más tarde Platón en las leyes, cito un pasaje de Leyes 9, 863e, denomino injusticia en general a la tiranía del timós en el alma y el miedo, el placer y el dolor, las envidias y los deseos. Pero aun cuando Platón insiste en resaltar los aspectos psicopolíticos negativos de dicha poesía, deja abierta la posibilidad en la República para pensar un paradigma poético alternativo basado en un tipo de poesía concebida como provechosa, buena y verdadera en el más alto grado. Como dicen República 10, 607d, 608a. E ilustrada a partir de los himnos dirigidos a los dioses y los encomios en honor de los héroes, géneros laudatorios a través de los cuales sería posible para él alcanzar una buena koinonia en términos psíquicos y políticos. Las nuevas generaciones se educarían así mediante una poesía que, supeditada al logos y al nomos, favorecería en ellas la unidad y el autodominio psíquicos como resultado de su estrecha vinculación con la parte racional del alma. De allí que frente a la psicologización de la política se vuelva para Platón prioritaria la crítica psicológica de la poesía mimética tradicional. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, sin nada más, abro la sesión para preguntas. Tenemos un poco menos de 10 minutos. Ivana, tú eres la primera.
Okay. Muchas gracias, Francisco. Muchas gracias, Lucas, por tu clarísima exposición. Yo tengo un montón de preguntas, pero voy a dejar a Carolina, así que voy a ser breve. Quería preguntarte, viste que hay algunos autores que no están de acuerdo, no pueden asegurar que en República 10 haya efectivamente tripartición del alma, en la medida que no están mencionadas explícitamente las tres partes del alma. Me pareció entender que vos adherís más bien a la postura de que sí están implícitamente. En el caso que sea así, digamos, ¿cuál sería el rol que te parece que debe, o que asume, digamos, en este panorama, en esta descripción que nos plantea Platón en su crítica a la poesía? ¿Qué rol debería asumir el signos? Lo digo pensando en cierta ambigüedad que tiene esta caracterización psicológica, digamos, o psicopatológica de la poesía imitativa. En fin, esa sería la pregunta. Dejo ahora por ahí. Por ahora.
Bien, bueno, gracias, Ivana. Sí, en la literatura crítica hay un montón de posiciones, no solo respecto de la tripartición del cuarto y la bipartición, sino las contradicciones en lo que respecta a la teoría del alma entre el libro cuarto y el 10. Hay algunos que dicen que directamente son contradictorios, otros que hay diferentes, digamos, objetivos, y eso es lo que determina los cambios de perspectiva. Yo lo que no me meto tanto en ese aspecto donde hay posiciones para todos los gustos, porque también Platón es un tanto ambiguo ahí, digamos, depende del libro. A lo que voy es que en función de su crítica a los poetas tradicionales, es como que simplifica el esquema y se concentra básicamente en ese conflicto entre, digamos, dos partes, ¿no? La parte racional y la irracional, donde ahí el timos estaría subsumido en la parte, entiendo, en la parte irracional, digamos, junto con lo apetitivo, pero ahí, también teniendo en cuenta cuestiones del libro cuarto, la función del timos es complicada, ¿no? Porque es una función mediadora, porque como vos, digamos, bien planteás, el timos puede jugar, digamos, para el bando de lo racional, siendo, ¿no? Como dice, un perro obediente, ¿no? Un perro manso, que de alguna manera acata los dictámenes de la parte, pero también puede jugar, y hay pasajes que puede jugar en alianza con lo apetitivo. En el caso de la crítica a la poesía mimético tradicional, los pasajes que él elige siempre son pasajes en donde está como muy marcada la alianza entre lo fogoso y lo apetitivo, entre el timos y lo concupiscible o lo apetitivo, ¿no? Entonces, es como que en estos pasajes que a mí me interesan del tramo del libro 10 relativos a la crítica a la poesía mimética, te diría que el timos está jugando siempre en alianza con lo apetitivo en detrimento de lo racional. Ahora, es verdad que siempre puedes encontrar un pasaje en donde, ¿no? Quizá haya una parte donde el timos, se me puede pasar, esté jugando con lo racional. Lo que sí es claro, pienso, creo, intuyo, hipotetizo, es que en esta poesía admisible, que apunta, te diría casi exclusivamente a un trato con lo racional, con los caracteres moderados, racionales, habría que ver cómo en esa poesía admisible jugaría el tratamiento del timos, ¿no? O sea, si en esa poesía admisible, platónicamente hablando, el timos, si es que llega a ser imitado, porque tampoco te da muchos ejemplos en la República, digamos, esboza la cuestión de los himnos, etc., habría que ver cómo jugaría, ¿no? El tratamiento de los aspectos fogosos en una poesía admisible. Creo que en las leyes eso está un poquito mejor desarrollado, porque República termina ahí, ¿no? Dejando un poquito la puerta abierta a esa poesía.
Claro, yo pensaba en la doble, además en la doble valencia, vos decís muy bien cómo imitar al Simós, pero además de que el Simós podría aparecer obviamente la poesía mimética como algo a representar, digamos, también es algo a educar, en el sentido que, otra vez, si él está admitiendo la posibilidad de una poesía aceptable, digamos, recomendable, quiere decir que es una poesía, digamos, que como toda poesía imitativa, apunta también a lo irracional, es decir, a educar a lo irracional, digamos, en fin, ¿no? Esa doble valencia del Timos es realmente paradójica en República. En fin, eso era. Muchas gracias, Lucas.
Si tenés en cuenta los géneros laudatorios, al final, son géneros en donde, digamos, de lo que se trata es de una imitación de los caracteres positivos, ¿no? O sea, es como que es un elogio, un encomio de los héroes, de aspectos, digamos, virtuosos, y de los dioses, ¿no? O sea, himnos a los dioses, y cuando uno empieza a analizar esos géneros, uno no encuentra la imitación de los aspectos, por eso digo, es difícil encontrar en esos pasajes de República cómo jugaría la imitación dentro de la poesía admisible de los caracteres timocráticos, ¿no? Sí, ligados al timos.
Carolina?
Gracias, Ivana.
Oi, Lucas.
Hola,
Obrigada. ¿Qué tal? Muchas gracias. Yo quería comprender un poco mejor una tesis más general, porque me toca ahora y quería saber un poco más cuál es su posición, porque si dices la psicologización de la política, en ese argumento de la poesía, me parece que entonces la estasis en la ciudad se explica por causa de la alma de los ciudadanos, porque la poesía causa tanto daño al alma de los ciudadanos, entonces que se puede explicar como todo. Entonces, en ese argumento así, dirías que entonces não é simplesmente que a justiça na alma é modelo para a justiça na cidade, mas que a justiça na alma é causa da justiça na cidade, porque a injustiça na alma causada pela poesia é causa da estasis da cidade. Você diria isso? ¿O no?
Es difícil, porque, a ver, si te puedo contestar, porque yo estoy tratando de establecer una vinculación que es un poco circular, en donde pongo la prioridad en el aspecto estásico del alma, porque, bueno, la poesía que Platón critica apunta justamente a estimular, fortalecer esas divisiones, esos aspectos estásicos. Y me parece que la paideia, digamos, gimnástico-musical, por la entidad que tiene, ¿no? La crítica, la paideia gimnástico-musical tradicional, por la entidad que tiene en el conjunto del diálogo, libros 2, libro 3, libro 10, me parece que cumple, podríamos decir, un rol de obstáculo importantísimo a la hora de lograr, ¿no? O de consumar una buena koinonia política, ¿no? O sea, me parece que la psicologización de la política, a ver si uno está de acuerdo con ese enfoque, ¿no? La psicologización de la política que aparece en el libro 4, para mí es central para entender la entidad que tiene la crítica psicopolítica a la poesía, que para mí es la crítica más importante. En eso creo con Belfiore, que para ella, para este intérprete, también tiene una importancia mayor que las otras críticas, ¿no? Que las críticas ético-política o ontológica, sino que la crítica psicológica, la crítica que cierra ese tramo de crítica a la poesía, es la que más tiene entidad, y justamente esa entidad yo la sustento, o trato de sustentarla con esa psicologización de la política, donde sí, el modelo para la justicia política sería ese paradigma, ¿no? Ese modelo de la justicia política sería la justicia psíquica, la posibilidad de una justicia psíquica. Pero es verdad, como le decía un poco Ivana, que podés encontrar pasajes en donde sostener lo contrario. Este es el problema, ¿no? O sea, yo, de hecho, en el trabajo cito pasajes en donde se puede argumentar en sentido contrario, donde la justicia política, digamos, sería el modelo, ¿no? Para pensar esa justicia psíquica. No sé si te contesto un poco, pero es un problema.
Gracias. Bueno, con eso podemos cerrar la sesión. Muchas gracias a todos. Aplauso a todos. So with that, we can close our session. Many thanks to everyone, participants and questioners alike. So bye.
So we'll meet tomorrow at 9, mañana a las 9 de la mañana. Yeah. Nuevamente. Have a good night.
Buenas noches, Raúl.
Buenas noches.
Gracias,
Chao, Carol. Chao, Lucas.
Chao, Karina. Chao.